cultivate a capacity for kindness. So, close your eyes. Take a few moments to breathe in and breathe out. But I would say on a deeper level, it's more like when we say work on yourself. That involves all kinds of like things about moving your life forward. And they struggle with
motivation in these things.
It's because when I don't think I'm worth it, I'm not worth fixing.
When you develop empathy and compassion for other people, there's going to be room for someone else in the relationship. And then this in turn is going to reduce the feeling of being an object. Now two people can connect. And now it's not about getting your needs met and starvation. It's about two human beings forming a relationship.
GG chat. Let's get started. Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. Just a reminder that, hello, my name is Dr. Alok Kanoja. Just a reminder that although I'm a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything is for educational or entertainment purposes only. If y'all have a medical concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Welcome, everybody. So happy Monday to all. We are going to do our deep dive into autism spectrum disorder today. So that'll be fun. I think this is going to run about 2 hours, probably at a minimum. And realistically, it may go all the way to 3. We have a ton of questions and posts, which I actually don't even know if we're going to get to. So thankfully, the content team over here at HG has given me lots of questions that people have asked about autism. I think we're going to cover a lot of it in some basic way in our kind of deep dive. But I know that there's a ton of interest in this. And once again, apologies to everyone who was, waiting for this to happen. About 2 weeks ago, I got sick and we had to reschedule. So apologies for that. One last thing is we've gotten several requests for references for our videos. It's an active thing that we're working on. And hopefully, we can get that to y'all kind of ASAP. So before we dive in, so just a couple of quick announcements. We're going to be talking with Dr. Ali Matu about social anxiety next week. Super looking forward to that. If y'all aren't familiar with Dr. Matu, he's a content creator, so has his own awesome YouTube channel and stuff, and then is an expert specifically on anxiety. So we're going to be having a conversation with him and sort of getting his expertise on anxiety. Another quick heads up, there are finally coaching spots open. So coaching has been full for about 2 years, and we've been doing our best to, try to support the people in the community who are interested in it. We've got personal spots open, group spots open, and career spots open. So just a quick kind of heads up for people who aren't familiar with our coaching program. We do a lot of stuff here at HG. We try to educate y'all. And I think the main reason to try coaching is if you want results within a particular amount of time. So, by all means, continue watching streams and videos and whatnot and doing the DIY stuff. But I think the main thing about coaching is that people actually make progress in a certain amount of time. So if you're someone who's always yeah, I always watch this stuff, I'm just watching content, but I'm never doing anything about it, then definitely check out our coaching program. A couple of things. So, we focus on things like how to develop purpose in life and how to build your motivation, how to understand yourself, how to understand some of the patterns that may be affecting things like your relationships and stuff like that. And then we also have certain offshoots like career coaching, which we sort of developed with Ethan Evans, who's was a senior VP at Amazon, led a team of 800 developers. And so there's a lot of good stuff in there about if y'all are focused on building a career, enhancing your career, sort of having that goal target can be very, very helpful. So check out coaching if y'all have been interested. I know a lot of people have been on the waiting list, and we finally have room after about 2 years. And so the program is also based on evidence-based principles, and we've made multiple iterations of it because we get a lot of feedback from y'all. So we keep improving, which is really awesome. So I think a lot of people have benefited from it. I ran into some people recently at a restaurant who were yeah, we both tried your coaching program and it really helped us a lot. So it seems like it works pretty well. We also have data to that effect. And we'll be presenting outcomes from our coaching program at a conference in about a month, probably. Okay, so today we are going to talk about autism spectrum. And this is kind of how I'm going to approach it, okay? So we're going to start by understanding, first of all, what is autism? So there's this angle of is it neurodiversity? Is it a diagnosis? Is it a disorder? Is it who I am? So we're going to start with actually some of those philosophical questions. Then we're going to dive into some of the sort of diagnostic criteria. So we're going to try to understand, okay, when someone is autistic or on the autism spectrum, what is different about them? And in the case of a disorder, what are the criteria for the disorder? Then what we're going to So we're going to go over a lot of the core features of autism there. Then we're going to talk a little bit about comorbidities in autism spectrum disorder. So what about depression and anxiety? Is it a feature of the disorder? Is it not a feature of the disorder? Can I have both? All this kind of stuff. Then we're going to dive into the etiology of autism. So what causes autism? How does one become autistic? And we've learned a lot and also still have a lot to learn. Then we're going to go into some gender-based considerations for autism spectrum disorder, including gender dysphoria and gender identity. Then we're going to talk a little bit about treatments. So once again, like, if y'all are concerned that you have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder or you think you could be on the spectrum, the gold standard and what y'all should absolutely do is see a professional, right? So go through the diagnostic criteria, see if it applies to you. And as we'll learn, treatment for autism spectrum disorder is highly, highly individualized. So please don't use this as a substitute for treatment. At the same time, we are going to go over, I'm almost like thinking about if I was teaching a group of medical students about what is autism, this is the kind of talk that I would give, okay? So we're going to talk about a lot of different treatment options. And then what we're going to do is, I don't know how else to say this. I'm going to just sort of share my personal approach when I'm working with someone who's on the spectrum. So this is not like, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about is like evidence-based like stuff. And this is just sort of a clinician, a single psychiatrist's experience of, okay, all the stuff that I've learned, when I take it to a patient, how do I think about it? What are the different ways that I approach treatment? Big disclaimer here, I have had a fair number of patients who are on the spectrum, but I am by no means an autism specialist. I have never worked in an autism-specific clinic that I can think of. Maybe one thing was kind of close. So I one time worked in a school, or like rotated is a better way to put it, in a school for people who are on the spectrum that was part of a mental health facility. So that's probably the closest that I've come to being ensconced within like autism treatment. At the same time, had a ton of patients and doing work in gaming and on the internet. I tend to see a lot of people who are on the spectrum. And then also have worked professionally with a lot of people on the spectrum. So we're not going to go into too many details here for reasons of privacy. But for example, a fair percentage of our coaches in our coaching program, some of them are on the spectrum as they've disclosed to us. They don't have to disclose anything like that. They just share that. And so I think it's really important from a peer support model. So, and that seems to work out great. Like they do an awesome job. So let's talk about autism spectrum. So the first thing is, if we look at in the field of psychiatry, we have this thing called autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5. So the DSM-5 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version number 5, which is how we in the field of psychiatry diagnose people with things. So we have to start by understanding how the DSM works. So a bunch of psychiatrists get together and they basically, like, oftentimes they're seminal researchers. They're like really experts in their field, and they will sort of decide, okay, what qualifies as autism and what doesn't qualify as autism. And then what has happened is traditionally autism has been treated as a disorder. So what makes a disorder? So there's one very common thing. So if you look at what's the difference between sadness and a mood disorder, what's the difference between being worried and an anxiety disorder? So the threshold from healthy to disorder in psychiatry has one shared thing. It interferes with your life in some substantial way. So we use this term impairment of function. And the reason that we kind of think of autism spectrum disorders is because these are things that appear to negatively impact people's lives. So autism spectrum disorder can interfere with your ability to form relationships. It can interfere with your ability to be successful professionally. It can interfere with your emotional wellness. It can sometimes lead to things like self-injurious behavior and stuff like that. So this is why we classify it as a disorder. Now, about, I would say 20 years ago, and this has gained a lot of steam in the last 10, there became this movement to classify certain things as neurodiversity. So ADHD is a good example of this, where a lot of people will say, like, this is not a disorder. This is a different kind of brain. And it's not that I am ill. I believe that my brain is different. Like, we're all human beings. We're all a little bit different. And I'm not broken. This is just a variation within a population. Now, even in the case of neurodiversity, these people tend to have challenges, right? Because the core problem with neurodiversity is that the world around us is not adapted to your brain. It is based on a neurotypical brain. So the structure of the institutions in the world assume that the brains of the participants are what we call neurotypical. Now, I've had patients who believe that autism spectrum disorder is a mental illness, is a disorder and something that warrants treatment. And I've had patients who believe more in the neurodiversity angle, which is that I'm just different. And everyone is different. Everyone needs to learn how to a certain degree, like adapt their internal functioning to the world around them, but I'm not ill in some way. Now, in the past, I've gotten in trouble, so we're banned from the ADHD subreddit because I made a video about how ADHD is positive in some ways, and I still believe that. Fair enough. So I'm going to do my best to take the feedback from those kinds of experiences and try to be as sensitive and careful as possible. So I've worked with patients who are like who view things as neurodiverse, and they don't consider autism to be a disorder or a disadvantage. It is just a feature of who they are. And I've worked with people who consider it to be a disorder and wish it wasn't this way, and this is a sign of illness. I've worked with both. So my take as a psychiatrist is like, if y'all are wondering, okay, is it neurodiversity? Is it a disorder? Like, is it a diagnosis? Is it a pathology? And that's for you to decide, right? So what the approach that I take as a psychiatrist is I'll adopt whatever system my patients want to adopt. So if they come to my office and they say, I want to get rid of this. This is interfering too much with my life. I want to learn to be different. I want to learn to be healthier. I want to have relationships. I'm like, okay, totally fine. We can treat it as a disorder and something to be fixed. Other people will come into my office and they'll be like, I want to figure out who I am, what makes me me, and how to interact with the world. I don't necessarily want to cure myself of anything, but I want to figure out how to interface with the rest of the world. That's fair enough too. So generally speaking, from a clinical perspective, like I said, the main thing is, does it interfere with function in some way? Okay. So y'all have to decide for yourselves, if you're on the autism spectrum, how do you view this? Do you view this as a problem to be fixed? Or do you view this as who you are and you need to figure out some way to interface with the world? Now, the good news is that in my experience as a psychiatrist, like, it's somewhat of an academic distinction. It can be really important in many ways, but when it comes down to what we are going to do, oftentimes a lot of the stuff is relatively similar, okay? Now, from a clinical perspective, I think both views are valid. I have seen cases that really stand out as good examples of each view. So, for example, I've worked with patients who have very severe autism. And what that means is that they can be verbal. So I'm thinking about one patient in particular. It just helps me when I think about people I've worked with. So verbal, but non-interactive. So what does this mean? This means that this boy can say things, but doesn't know how to respond to questions, doesn't directly communicate with other people, and it goes to school of a sort, has some degree of like capability, but, you know, at the age of 12 or 13, still cannot toilet by themselves, cannot dress themselves, can be hyper fixated on particular things, has temper tantrums, this kind of stuff, right? So when I look at that, I look at this person and I think to myself, okay, this person is not capable of caring for themselves. And when I talk to this person's parents, there is no doubt in their mind that this is a disorder, that this is not just like who he is. I mean, he certainly has a personality and they've come to love their child just like any parent does. And like, that's wonderful and all. But like the amount of effort they have to expend and the amount of support that the child needs, this does not feel like a non-disorder, if that makes sense. I've also worked with people who are very high functioning on the autism spectrum. So these are people who are friends of mine in medical school, who have become successful physicians and have very, very good bedside manner. And for these people, they view things slightly differently. I have patients like this too, where to them, like, this isn't a disorder. This is just who I am, and I have to learn how to live with it. So I see like arguments on both sides. And I think it's like up to you to decide what fits with you. Okay. So, the last thing to consider about autism spectrum disorder, and I think this is kind of like a good point to make, is that a lot of the disorder doesn't come out of the features of autism itself. It comes out of the interaction between the kind of brain that you have and the world around you. So if we think about like the way that, let's say, some people on the autism spectrum are quite perseverative. So they love like a particular thing, and they can spend a lot of time focused on that thing, talking to other people about that thing. This kind of gets made fun of quite a lot, is a very strong stereotype for autism, that like this person can talk to you about trains for 4 hours and you can express zero interest and they just can kind of keep going. So I think there's another key feature that we have to understand about autism, which is that a large portion of the challenges in autism, whether you consider them clinical or aclinical, that's your choice. Many of the challenges that human beings face have to do with the interaction between yourself and the environment around you. Okay? And this is not just true of autism. So many people think, oh, like, but is that just autism? What about the other illnesses? So I'll give you a couple of other examples, okay? So if you live alone on a desert island, can you have social anxiety, right? I mean, chances are you sort of can, right? Because when you're going to bed at night, you'll remember something before you were on the desert island when you were very socially anxious and you said something stupid. Like someone, you're at a restaurant at an airport and the waiter says, have a nice flight. And then you say, you too, even though they're not going anywhere and feel silly. But can social anxiety exist if you are by yourself? Another good example is if you have a genetic vulnerability to alcohol addiction and you have no access to alcohol, what does that mean? Are you an addict, not an addict? So if we look at a lot of our mental health diagnoses, they require some amount of interaction between the environment and yourself. So in the absence of alcohol, an alcoholic has no problems. But in the presence of alcohol, alcoholics can have a problem. So a lot of the challenges that we see when I'm working with people on the spectrum is not like this is wrong with you, this is busted. It is that when your neuroatypical brain interacts in a world that is not designed for brains like yours, you run into problems. And usually that is what I focus on. And that's what we're going to kind of walk y'all through towards the end, okay? So a couple of just perspectives. This is something that we call the stress diathesis model in medicine. I think I have that right. So this is kind of this concept that like illnesses emerge in the right circumstances. So diabetes, a tendency for type 2 diabetes, a genetic vulnerability, whatever, emerges when you add a certain kind of diet or exercise to the equation. So it's like person plus environment. This is really where the problems arise, okay? So, give me a second. Make sense? Okay? Ableism. Yeah, so that's like what I see people commenting about ableism and stuff. So that's where all that stuff comes into the picture, right? Is we have like all of these features, right? So we have like ramps to enter buildings in the United States. And this is accommodation for people who use wheelchairs or assistive devices for mobility. Makes sense. We don't have similar things very often for things that are mental in nature. So we have a lot of these like physical, like we have Braille on drive-up ATMs, right? So we're trying to accommodate for people who are different in some way. And oftentimes the challenge with autism spectrum is people aren't aware of what the challenges are. And we rarely do we like accommodate and build structures to help these people out, okay? So it's a very common challenge. All right, so let's dive into diagnostic criteria, okay? So kind of TLDR, is autism an illness? Well, that kind of, it's for you to decide, right? So you get to decide whether you want to view this as an illness or whether you want to view it as just like a difference, okay? So let's talk about the core features of autism spectrum disorder, okay? So the first core feature, can you all hear me? Okay, this is, okay. Oh, this isn't showing anything. All right, we'll just use this then. Okay, so what are the core features of autism spectrum disorder? So the first core feature is that it is a spectrum. As we've already said, there's a wild difference between people who have severe cases of autism spectrum disorder, who are like nonverbal, non-interactive, etc., and people who are highly functional. Okay, so the first thing is like, it's patchy. So I think about autism as patchy. We're going to go over like what the commonly perceived deficits are. But this is part of the reason that, first of all, it's so hard to do a deep dive into autism, because who are we talking about? Are we talking about treatment for people who are nonverbal, non-interactive, unable to toilet? Or are we talking about people who are like third-year medical students? So it's really interesting, right? Because the interventions for each person are drastically different. So this is the first feature of autism. This is also what makes it like sometimes challenging to diagnose. So we'll get into more of this later, but 70% of people on the autism spectrum also have a comorbid mental illness. So that means they have something like depression, anxiety, something in that vein. OCD, social anxiety. So oftentimes what happens is we'll miss autism, especially in girls. We'll get to that a little bit later. Because the features that girls exhibit, if they're autistic, are more likely to be called something else. So girls are more likely to get diagnosed with anxiety disorders, OCD, because that's what it looks like from the outside. So now let's talk a little bit about what are the core features. So first thing is that it's a spectrum. Second thing is that there's difficulties with social, emotional reciprocity. Okay? So let's talk about this for a second. What does this mean? So we have some circuits of our brain that when we socialize, do some of this translating work for us. Okay, so if we look at the body and the brain, we have certain functions. So let's use something really simple like temperature regulation. So when we're hot, we have this system in our body that automatically activates, looks at the circumstance, detects the temperature, right? So we have temperature receptors on the back of our neck, for example. And so detects the temperature and says, okay, our temperature is too high, therefore we're going to sweat. So results in increased peripheral blood flow. The capillaries near our skin start to expand. We have hot blood flowing through there, and then we also start to sweat. So when we sweat, we put beads of water on our skin, we extrude water, and then water evaporates. When water evaporates, it cools, right? So the energy from the phase change of a liquid water to a gas state requires the absorption of energy. We have to boil water to get it to turn from a liquid into a gas. Now, when we sweat, where does that boiling energy come from? It comes from our skin. So literally, like, sweating is almost boiling water off of our skin. That's what sweating is. So we reduce the temperature in our body by evaporating moisture off of our skin. This is an example of a homeostatic process. So one of the core features of autism spectrum disorder is we have this similar stimulus response homeostatic process when we interact with other people. So I'll do things like I'll make eye contact. And when I make eye contact, when I look into someone's eyes, I see the soul. Oh, the eyes are the window to the soul. What does that mean? That means that when you look into someone's eyes, you get a lot of information about that purpose, right? We'll even say this a lot in things like our fiction literature and stuff like that. Someone smiles, but the smile doesn't reach their eyes. Can y'all tell the difference? This is a smile that doesn't reach my eyes. I'm not really smiling. This looks like a grimace, right? So we get a lot of information. And then we get a lot of information about things like tone, body language, eye contact. So the parts of our brain that interpret this information, these are the social circuits of our brain, the empathic circuits of our brain, for whatever reason, are not functional in the same way as a neurotypical person. So people with autism spectrum disorder have a lot of difficulty maintaining eye contact. So since they have difficulty maintaining eye contact, they no longer have access to other people's souls. And when they don't have access to other people's souls, their ability to practice necromancy is severely hampered. So when they lose access to other people's souls, it is very difficult for them to get information about what someone else is thinking or feeling. So we see this in practical ways, like I can talk about trains for 4 hours because I'm not receiving or processing the information that you were bored and that you don't enjoy this. So we see that the social emotional reciprocity has something to do with our empathic circuits. We also see, generally speaking, some degree of impairment in something called theory of mind in people on the autism spectrum. So their capacity to step outside of their shoes and put themselves in the shoes of another person is difficult. Now, remember, it's a spectrum. Some people don't have a problem with this. This is absolutely a skill that can be learned. But on average, if I take a neurotypical person and someone who's on the autism spectrum disorder, on the ASD spectrum, what is the difference? There is some degree in like difficulty of like social emotional reciprocity. So there's another key feature here. Let's go ahead and take notes, okay? So social emotional reciprocity means reading non-verbal cues, okay? This also means like very simple things like difficulty with eye contact, which we'll get into. So this is an example of social norms. Difficulty with theory of mind. Okay. And so this results in difficulty in social relationships. And practically what I see in my patients is like, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but they don't have access to certain information. And so the way that I kind of view like autism spectrum disorder, when I'm sitting with a patient, like hopefully this is not offensive. This is, something that we've discussed before with patients of mine. I kind of view like autism spectrum disorder as doing like New Game Plus or like some kind of weird like adaptation to the regular way that you play the game. So like, for example, I've played like Final Fantasy games where they do something like a level 1 challenge. So there's no leveling up, right? So the way that the game is normally played is like you level things up. And then as you level up, like the game gets easier. And then like life is like you're better suited to play life, right? So you have more challenging situations. We've got some friends in high school. Then we've got boyfriends and girlfriends. And then we're going to get married. And then we have kids. And then we have in-laws. And we have work relationships. So if we look at like, we level up in life. Now, the challenge with people on the spectrum is that the way that their brains are wired, like there's some dimensions of life that they do not easily have access to. Right? So now we're doing a level 1 challenge. And now this is kind of where we also get to the treatment philosophy, which is like, okay, this is the way that you are. You can still win the game. It's just that the solutions that work for normal people may not work for you. So we have to understand what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses, what are you good at, what do you need to improve on, what do you need to adapt to, and that's the way that we live the game, play the game, okay? And social emotional reciprocity is kind of at the top of the list. So there's another like really great example of a couple of these things. So we're talking about social norms. So there's another like really interesting, a couple of other concrete things. So let's talk about social norms for a second. So one really interesting kind of diagnostic feature of there's a simple diagnostic test that you can do. Now remember that this is patchy. Okay? So this doesn't apply to everyone, but when I was learning about autism, one of the things that I learned is that when a human being points, okay? So let's say I'm pointing. So it requires some degree of theory of mind to infer that when I'm pointing, I don't want you to look at this. I want you to look at the thing that I'm pointing at. And so one of the really interesting, simple questions that you can ask to assess the severity of autism spectrum is you can ask parents, when you point, does your child know what you're looking at? And I think this is a really great example, not to try to shame anyone or make people feel stupid. It's just, I hope you all understand this, that, see, our brain has certain ways of translating information. And if you're on the spectrum, depending on to what degree you're on the spectrum, you don't have access to those things. And for those of y'all that are neurotypical, I want y'all to try to imagine, and this is really why I kind of included this example. I want you to imagine how difficult your life would be if you could not understand something simple as pointing, right? We take so much, when we're neurotypical, we take so much for granted about our ability to move through the world. And these things, like when you point at something, like, do people know what you're pointing at? Like, can they tell? Whereas if you don't even understand that level of like nonverbal communication, it makes things incredibly difficult. So for me, like when I learned this and I kind of like, and when it sank into my mind, it helped me develop a lot of compassion for my patients with autism. I started to really understand, like, holy crap, I'm taking so much for granted about my ability to relate to other people. Okay. So then there are a couple of other features of this. Okay. So another one is speaking in a concrete way. So oftentimes people on the spectrum will speak very concretely. So things like flirtation or innuendo, or even to a certain degree, humor. These things can be very challenging, right? So like, it's like, hey, like you can call me sometime if you want. You know, sometimes when I work with people who are on the spectrum, like they have a lot of difficulty in dating because someone will say like, you can call me sometime if you want to. And then they get confused. They're like, okay, when is sometime? Is now sometime? So then what they'll do is they'll like call in like 5 minutes later and say, they said, hey, you said I could call sometime and this is sometime, therefore I'm calling you now. And so there's a lot of stuff about developing and maintaining relationships. Because if we look at the science of relationships, like relationships are not developed in a concrete way. Okay? They're not like, we don't, there isn't actually like a script. Like we'll have all kinds of people on the internet who will tell us like, here's a script, like here's what you should do on a first date. Here's what you don't do on a first date. And this is a really common feature of the patients that I work with is that when they look at socialization, it becomes a process of demystifying the scripts of social interaction. So normally like we have an intuitive sense of when something is okay or not okay. But we have to understand this. When I have an intuitive sense of, oh, that joke went too far. Like, I kind of went too far with that joke. If we really think about it, what's going on? We have sensory input that is coming in through my eyes, my ears, maybe even my nose. And then I'm like looking at all like everyone's reaction. I'm seeing that everyone's like, yeah. Right? When I see something like that, there's a lot of like rich verbal, there's a lot of rich verbal tone. There's a lot of rich facial expression. People are kind of laughing, but I see the eye roll. I can't do that unless I'm looking at them, right? So that requires eye contact. So there's a lot of rich information. And so in the absence of that rich information, what people on the spectrum tend to do is they're like, I don't have access to that. So what they do is they develop very complicated, like, scripts about social interaction. This is how they manage to function, right? They learn like, okay, when someone says thank you, you say you're welcome. Like we train all children to say that, hopefully. But then that's some stuff that we teach children. But then the majority of children like learn most of it on their own. Like they learn some degree of reciprocity. They learn some degree of like, sometimes I should win and sometimes I should lose. They learn some degree of this. If this kid invites me to play, I should invite them. But with people on the autism spectrum, what I've noticed is that every one of these is basically like a class that you have to take. None of it is automatic, or not none, but less of it is automatic. So learning social interactions becomes scripted. This is just very common. And this runs into problems because sometimes things deviate from the script, right? So a simple example is if we look at something like flirting, like sometimes flirting is like requires someone to be insulting, right? So it's like, oh, like, hey, can I call you sometime? You think I would go out with you? You would be so lucky. And then like people are like, why did they call? Like, I don't understand. Okay. Like, and then they give you their number, right? You'd be so lucky. If you call, like, I may answer. So here they are like insulting you on the one hand, but if you pay attention to their body language, if you pay attention to their facial expression, there's some degree of ambiguity. And a big part of flirting is actually ambiguity, right? So it's kind of like, this is why we use things like innuendo, right? So, I can't think of something in the moment, but like when we flirt, right? They're like, oh, hey, do you want me to take your car to the car wash? And then someone's like, yeah, you can absolutely take my car to the car wash anytime you want, right? That's like, what the hell does that? I don't even know what that means. But that's what flirting is like. There's a lot of innuendo. There's a lot of nonverbal cues. There's a lot of eye contact, facial expressions. And so these kinds of things become incredibly challenging. And so then what happens is people on the spectrum will usually learn some kind of script, right? So this is how you ask people out. I got to go to the gym. I got to make $100,000. I got to grow to 6 feet tall. And once I do this, I will ask people out and then they will say yes. So they're almost very data focused is kind of the way that I think about it when I work with people. Okay. So there are a couple of other like important things here. So let me. Okay. So another important feature is that we also know objectively that this is also difficult because people on the autism spectrum literally experience more anxiety and uncertainty. So if we look at like their physiological level of stress, their physiological level of stress is like objectively higher in social situations, right? So this has been studied in things like fMRI studies and stuff like that. The intensity of emotion that they experience is actually higher. Which is also why like people who are neurotypical like don't understand this, like they don't get it. I'll give you all like we'll talk about that a little bit, but they don't understand that like, okay, when I go to the gym, like it's a little bit anxiety provoking, but it's not that bad. You just need to go, bro. Like you just need to go. They don't understand that like for some people on the autism spectrum, going to the gym is like very, very uncomfortable. That it's the way that I kind of describe it is like nails on the chalkboard. Like it's like way more, there's like an annoying sound and there's like nails on the chalkboard, which is like very, very painful to listen to. And that's the experience of some of these people on the spectrum. So this is what I was going to talk about later, but we'll just jump into it now. So I'll give you all an example of something called ARFID. I forget what it stands for. Restrictive feeding something. Let's find out. Let me look real quick. What is ARFID? Can't believe I blanked out. Avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. Okay, so we have ARFID. So like this is something that a lot of parents don't understand about kids with autism. So remember that their brains are different. So what's another dimension that the brain can be different? So when we eat something, okay, there's like textures. And we find some textures to be unpleasant and some textures to be pleasant. So the challenge is in some people who have autism or something like ARFID, which is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, their experience of eating things is much more painful than our experience of eating things. So a neurotypical brain, like really simple example, like things like green onions or cilantro. So oftentimes when we eat food, we'll add a garnish, right? And the garnish adds a variety of texture and a variety of flavor. But for some people who are on the spectrum, that garnish feels like nails on the chalkboard. It's like, okay, I'm going to turn on music, but then what I'm going to do is add some nails on the chalkboard on top. And you're like, I hate this. So one of the really sad things that I see a lot with kids on the spectrum, especially if their parents aren't aware, is like the parents will punish the kid a lot for like not eating food. They'll be like, you have to eat this. You have to eat this. Like, I don't understand why you want pasta and chicken nuggets and macaroni. Like, that's the only things that you'll eat. Like, you need to learn how to eat your vegetables. And even then, people on the spectrum can eat vegetables. It's just, we take for granted that, okay, when I steam some broccoli and I add sesame oil and sesame seeds on top, I'm adding a little bit of crunch. When I add furikake to rice, like I'm adding crunch and texture and all these kinds of things, that this is a very unpleasant, it's a neurologically unpleasant experience. This is not being a picky eater. This is very important to understand. This is what we're learning, is that literally like the sensory receptors in your mouth and in your tongue transmit signals to your brain, and the signals in your brain get interpreted in a certain way. So the best example that I have is if y'all have ever had eggs that have a piece of shell in them. Think about how that piece of shell ruins the eggs. Like you can have a tiny bit of piece of shell, fucking ruins your eggs, right? You're like, ugh, it's got shell in it. And now if you're autistic, this is what the rest of the world does to you. They're like, hey, take this omelet. We're going to crunch up this shell and we're going to fucking sprinkle it on top. And then like you force this kid to eat it and the kid is like, this is disgusting. Like, I can't eat this. They start vomiting. The parents get angry. This is like a day in the life of someone with autism spectrum disorder. It's like, we're going to take the way that you want to live life and we're going to just sprinkle some shittiness on top of it. Oh, you want to have relationships? We're going to sprinkle some difficulty on top. You want to eat this food? We're going to sprinkle something nasty on top. That's the best way I can describe it, right? And I've worked with these people for years now, and it's like, it's crazy how challenging their lives are. So if you're working with someone or you know, you have a relationship with someone or you have a brother or sister, like, you got to understand that these people are not trying to be difficult. They're not picky eaters. They're not selfish. I mean, they can be all those things too, but no more or less than the rest of the population. That their experience of life is fundamentally different from neurotypical people's. Things are harder in a different way. The things that we take for granted that we never imagined, you're like, can you just imagine if every meal that you eat, someone is sprinkling some amount of broken glass or broken shell, or like, oh, look, let's like scoop up some hair. Let's take this cat's hairball and toss it on top of your steak. Right? Like, this is what their experience of life is. Like, that, like, something is just, we're going to add some crappiness on top. And this is why they love chicken nuggets and macaroni and cheese. It's because something about the way that their sensory receptors, their taste buds, not even taste, I think it's oftentimes due to texture. That's really what we see in ARFID. Is like the textures really bother them. And so it's just challenging. Okay. I know we're talking about social emotional difficulties, but you know, so that's a side note. We jumped ahead a bit. Okay. Does that make sense? Like eggshells on top of eggs. Okay. Now, so let's go back to developing relationships for a second. This goes down. Okay, so there's, this is commonly what I see in my patients. So since they have difficulties with these things like eye contact and tone and stuff like that, they oftentimes get labeled as creepy. Okay, sometimes they're labeled as aggressive. Okay. Sometimes they have difficulty with appropriate behavior. And sometimes they also will have like a very one-sided friendship. And I'll talk about what this means. Okay, so let's go through these in order. So why do people on the spectrum frequently get blamed for being creepy or aggressive or inappropriate? And then we'll talk about one-sided relationships, okay? So the first thing is like, what makes someone creepy, right? So if we look at creepy, creepy is not like a thing. Like a thing that you do does not make you creepy. It is not an action, right? So if I grab someone's butt, right? So this could be creepy behavior or it could not be creepy behavior. So it's kind of like, it's not the action that's creepy. It's the circumstances, the relationship, the tone that's creepy. So I'll tell you all a story about one time that I grabbed my wife's butt. And what I did is I slipped an ice cube down the crack of her pant, in the back of her pants. And kind of like grabbing her butt. And the reason I did that is I was visiting her family's house, right? So like we were like early on in our relationship. And so, you know, her mom was in the kitchen, that we were all in the kitchen, we're making dinner together. And then I take a cube of ice and I slip it down the back of her pants and then she jumps. And then it's kind of like this sort of thing where it's like, is she really like, I'm there because she wants to introduce me to her parents. Right? She's like, oh, like, you know, we didn't say it at the time because as Indians, you're not allowed to tell your parents you're dating. But like, she's like, okay, so like she wants me to make a good impression. I'm making a great impression. I'm like, oh, Auntie G, hello. Right? And I slipped this cube because now I've trapped her because she's like, hey, asshole, don't do that. Then it makes me look bad in front of her parents, which defeats the purpose. Then her parents are going to be against the relationships. It's kind of like a troll, right? So if you kind of look at that, like slipping an ice cube down the back of someone's pants is like, generally speaking, not a good idea. Like if I'm at school and I slip, a cube of ice down someone's pants, if there's a girl that I don't know or a guy that maybe dudes, it's a little bit different. Case in point, right? So it's all about context. So what happens is if you're learning socialization as a script, you're learning like what the sequences are. You're not aware of the context because here's the problem. with like dating advice from neurotypical people to autistic people is us neurotypical people, we assume so much. We take so much for granted that we don't even include it as part of the script, right? So for example, like if it's almost like socialization with people on the spectrum. And I know this sounds insulting. It's really not my intention to be insulting. It's my intention to really share for people who are not on the spectrum how difficult it is. So it's kind of like doing tech support for boomers. It's like if you're doing tech support for boomers, and I know it's like not a very flattering thing, but it's like if you're doing tech support for boomers, it's like, you know, you don't, okay, how do I get this program to run? Well, you double click the icon. And it's like, wait, where you need to start is the computer on? Is your monitor plugged in? There are certain things that we just assume when you are tech savvy. And the challenge with autism is that something about their brain makes it very difficult for them to figure this stuff out on their own, because the way that they interpret information, the way that they access information, they just don't have access to some of it, or they have to work way harder to get it. And so then we give people advice. They're like, oh yeah, so if you're like into a girl, you should slap her on the ass. Or if you're into a guy, you should slap him on the ass. And they're like, okay, I'm going to execute this script. And then they run into trouble because they don't have the context that is necessary. And then this is what's incredibly traumatic about it. Like, I'm convinced that growing up with autism, depending on whether it's treated or untreated, is almost certainly traumatic in some way. And like the challenge is like, now you've been burned. Now you get a reputation as a creep. And like people, no one gives you like the benefit of the doubt. No one's like, hey, this kid doesn't understand socialization in the same way that boomers don't understand technology. We need to be more patient with them. We need to be more compassionate. I'm not saying that they're incapable or that they're stupid or anything like that. It's just they have an uphill battle to climb. That's been my clinical experience of working with people on the spectrum. It's an uphill battle in some dimensions. Okay? So if we look at creepiness, creepiness is all about context. It's all about tone. It's all about appropriateness. And so when I work with people on the spectrum, what they'll usually do is they're looking for scripts. So they're like, after how many dates is it okay to slap someone on the ass? And it's kind of like, well, there's no like, it could be 1, it could be 4, it could be 8, it could be never, depending on the person. So you can't learn a script, right? A lot of it has to be intuitive. Similarly, this can also be viewed as aggressive. So my patients get punished a lot because they're just reciprocating. It's like, okay, this guy like threw a water balloon at me at work. So the way that things happen is when someone does something to you, you do it back to them. So like they threw 1 water balloon, and also there's a certain amount of escalation. So I'm going to throw 18 at them, right? And they get labeled as aggressive. Sometimes they also have difficulty with appropriate behavior, and there are like studies about this. Okay, so this isn't just me saying like, oh my God, like people with autism are incapable. There's studies. We've been able to detect this. If you talk to people on the autism spectrum and you ask them, what do you get in trouble for? People will say, well, you're doing this inappropriately. And this has been so heartbreaking when I work with people who are like asking people out. Like romance is a really good example where like this is inappropriate. And the crazy thing, and they're not wrong, where like sometimes they'll be like, I'm confused because other people do it and they don't get labeled as inappropriate. Like, I asked this girl out at work and she said it's inappropriate to ask out a coworker, but like my cubicle mate just asked this other person out and they're dating. So that wasn't inappropriate, and this is inappropriate. I'm really confused why, which is their experience. The other thing is that oftentimes the relationships that they develop can be quite one-sided. So what this means is that sometimes you'll have people, and I know this sounds, once again, like kind of offensive, but, there are studies about this stuff. It's not my intention. It's just, let's call it what it is. So sometimes you'll have one-sided relationships where like there isn't reciprocity. So sometimes people on the spectrum are very likely to get taken advantage of in relationships because they don't even realize when they're being taken advantage of, or they do realize when they're being taken advantage of, but they don't quite understand what's going on. So they feel the negative emotions of shame. They feel the negative emotions of self-esteem. They feel some degree of anger, but they're not quite sure why. And sometimes what I'll do with these people is like work with them to really like work through, okay, why are you feeling this way? This actually is not appropriate what your friend is doing, right? And it'll be something, once again, script-oriented, where they're like, friends make sacrifices for friends. Since I am a friend, I'm going to make sacrifices. And then people will expect them to make sacrifices over and over and over again, and they have difficulty bridging the gap from like there's reciprocity. That's what's really difficult for them. Okay? And then sometimes we also see like there's actually literature about sort of like being taken in by a group of friends. So this is also, it's kind of like nice in some ways, but it's also like challenging in some ways, where oftentimes you'll have one person who's on the spectrum who is friends with other people who are neurotypical, which is fantastic. I had that in med school, right? So we had a friend who happened to be on the autism spectrum. Fair enough. Like, we were all gamers. Like, that's what bound us. And so sometimes you can kind of get like, patients of mine have described it as being taken in. Okay. Now, I don't like the implication of that, right? It implies like orphanage and stuff like that, but we do see that. So we'll see like these relationships that aren't fully reciprocal, not necessarily negative. So these are just things that to be aware of. These are what the relationships can look like. We're not saying that they're good or bad or right or wrong or whatever. You as an individual have to decide whether you're happy with this or unhappy with this, and whether you want to change it or not change it, right? So we're not trying to imply, or I'm not trying to imply, a value judgment. This is just my experience as a clinician of working with these people. Okay? So that's all of the social stuff. Okay. Let's move on. So the second domain, so this is domain number 1, actually. I guess you could say that's domain number 1. So domain number 2 is developing, maintaining, oh, sorry, we already did that. Okay. Restricted behaviors, interests, and activities, as well as repetitive behaviors or activities. Okay? So this can be like, basically people on the spectrum will sometimes have a very restricted or repetitive approach to like interests or activities. So on like the, less harmful end, it can be things like obsession with trains or some other object, right? I'm super into this stuff. I love baseball cards. I love Pokemon cards. So like there isn't, if you look at like the average neurotypical person versus the average autistic person, the average autistic person may have fewer interests that are like more intense. And the interesting thing is that, there are studies on people who are called autistic savants. So these are people who are like incredibly gifted because they're so hyper-focused. And by the way, we'll get to this a little bit later, but autism spectrum in some ways has a correlation with IQ, but in some ways doesn't. So a great example of this is the guy who, I don't know if y'all remember this, but in the United States in 2007, 2008, there was a problem called a subprime mortgage crisis. So basically what would happen is banks would give out loans to people who really couldn't afford loans. And then the banks did something really interesting. So if I loan like $1 million, okay, to someone who really can't afford $1 million house, and then I do it 4 more times, right? So if you look at this and like this person doesn't make enough money, then what the bank does, now I'm out $1 million, right? And so what the banks would do is they're trying to sell that loan, because over the lifespan of the loan, this may be worth, I don't know, 1.3, right? So it's worth 1.3 over the life, assuming the person pays it back. So normally what would happen is they would sell this for maybe like 1.1, and then they'd get this money and they'd give out another loan. They'd sell this, they'd give out more, they'd give out more. But in order to sell these individual loans, like someone would have to look at this, look at their credit and say, okay, like I'll accept that debt because this person will pay it back. Okay. Then what happens, they started doing something. They started bundling these loans. So they started almost turning it into like a sausage. So we're going to take all these little bits of meat and we're going to grind them up into something tasty. And now I'm going to sell you a $5,900,000 loan. And all the risk is hidden. So then the bank got $5,900,000, which means that they gave out 6 more loans. And they repeated this process over and over and over again until there were a bunch of loans out there. that people could not pay back. And the way that this was disguised because we're bundling them together. So the first person to figure this out was actually someone on the spectrum. Okay, so this is something that if you guys have read, who's the guy who wrote The Big Short? Michael Lewis. So he talks about this in his book, right? So the first person who figures it out, this person, like all of Wall Street is like, oh my God, there's so much money to be made, so much money to be made. Some guy who's a radiologist who then goes into finance and then like figures this out. He's like, hey, this is a house of cards. This is going to collapse. So we know that people on the spectrum have very, very oftentimes they have very restricted interests, but they can be like really, really competent in those interests. Okay. So we also have kind of less functional adaptations of that, right? So this is where I'm not saying that every person on the spectrum is a savant by any means, but let's just get rid of all this. Dr. K's random aside. Great book, by the way. And I've had patients who are similar. So when I work with people with autism spectrum, a big part of it is figuring out, okay, if you love trains, what can we do with that, right? It's super cool. It can be very rewarding. Because oftentimes people with autism are like, I need to change this about myself. I don't necessarily agree. It's for you to decide what do you want to change and what do you want to leverage. So this repetitive behavior, this is on the higher functioning side. We also have in autism, the lower functioning side of this. So we'll have things like flapping, or even echolalia, which is repeating what other people say. So when I work with people who are not nonverbal, but they're verbal, so they speak, but they don't know how to have a conversation. So if you say how is Alok doing today? They'll say, how is Alok doing today? So something about their circuitry around verbalization is functional in some way, but they're not capable of a conversation. So we can sometimes get echolalia. We can get things like flapping, even the way that they use objects. So patterned object use, which oftentimes gets mistaken for OCD. But 20% of people on the autism spectrum actually have OCD. So that complicates things. So this is the way that I'm going to make my coffee. It has to be this way every single time. We have to add it to the French press. It needs to be in the French press for 60 seconds. Then I'm going to, push it down. And it has to be a repetitive pattern of usage is common. Next thing is we talked about, so then the next thing is rituals or patterns of behavior. We kind of talked about that, right? So the way that I make coffee or things like that are very, very fixed. It has to be this way. And if things are not that way, then oftentimes there is what we would call from a neurotypical perspective, a disproportionate emotional response that can result in something like a temper tantrum or something like that. So we see restrictive and repetitive behaviors. Okay, so things are very ritualized. Things are kind of more set in stone. There's less general flexibility. In the more severe cases, we're seeing things like flapping and echolalia. On the positive end, we can see an obsession that can make you millions and millions of dollars. And then there's also some of these features that look a little bit like OCD. Okay? Okay. The next thing that I'm going to talk about, so I don't know if this is actually a diagnostic criteria, but this is something that I tend to focus a lot on, is emotional regulation. So we see this a lot in neurodiversity in general. So whether you have ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, we'll sometimes see certain brain challenges. So one is emotional regulation. So there's a tendency for things like temper tantrums. We know that people on the spectrum literally experience more anxiety and sometimes increased levels of stress. So what does this mean? How can you experience more anxiety? We talked about this a little bit, but basically what happens is you can take any scenario, like applying for a job or going on a date or, or whatever. And if you measure the average stress response as measured by cortisol, cerebral blood flow to your amygdala, you can take whatever cortisol, whatever measurement of stress that you want. What we literally see is that people on the spectrum and people who have ADHD will sometimes experience amplified emotions. So there's even a subtype of ADHD, which has been hypothesized to be an emotional regulation subtype. So we have attention deficit disorder. We have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this is a subset. So hyperactivity means that this person is up and moving around a lot. So some kids with ADHD or ADD, some kids have ADHD, they move around a lot. Some kids don't have ADHD, they have ADD. Their attention wanders a lot, but they don't move. There's a third subtype of emotional dysregulation. So what we know from working with people on autism, the autism spectrum, is that their emotional responses to things can be quite amplified. And this comes down to the neurocircuitry. Like literally the brain's capacity to regulate an emotional response is oftentimes impaired. So what does that mean practically? That means that you get pissed faster. So the onset of being angry increases. The duration of how long you are angry increases, and the intensity increases. So practically what this looks like is if we have a situation, okay, of time and anger. If our neurotypical person is like this, someone on the spectrum may be like that. So the onset is faster, it's actually higher, and it lasts way longer than for a neurotypical person. So oftentimes in treatment of kids on the autism spectrum disorder, a big part of treatment for parents is managing things like temper tantrums and stuff like that, okay? Because this happens, they just experience emotions more intensely, more rapidly, and for longer periods of time. All right? This probably has to do with some degree of something called executive function disorder. Or maybe not executive function. That's not, some kind of frontal lobe deficit is a better way to put it. So we have the frontal lobes are the part of our brains that inhibit and regulate other parts of our brain. Some of those are sometimes, that circuitry is a little bit, the connections are a little bit weaker. Okay? All right. So these are kind of the overall features of autism spectrum disorder. Now, when you take these core features, remember, this is derived from a clinical perspective, right? So this is like looking at things like the DSM, where so this kind of assumes that people have impaired function. So when we're talking about impairment of function in more severe cases of autism, what are the kinds of things that we see? The other really interesting thing we'll get to is that some of these core features result in a different phenotype. So remember that a phenotype is like the presentation. The genotype is like where you start, and the phenotype is what it looks like. So we'll get to things like masking and stuff like that, but like we'll talk a lot about masking. But if we look at masking, like why do we mask in the first place? So we mask because some of this other stuff. So I don't understand social behavior. I have a script. I have a lot more emotion than is appropriate. People tell me like, why are you so upset? This is not that big of a deal. So what does the child with autism learn how to do? They learn how to hide their upsetness. So these are the roots that emerge as things like masking behaviors and all kinds of other more subjective challenges that people experience. Okay? So let's talk about comorbidities for a second. Okay? So this is wild. First is 70% of people have at least one other diagnosis. 40% of people have two other diagnoses. These are mental health diagnoses, okay? So something like depression, anxiety. So leading the top of the list, 30 to 40% have a mood disorder. The more realistic numbers are closer to 30, but in my clinical experience, I would say closer to 40. About 30% of people have an anxiety disorder. Literature says maybe about 25%. I think it's a little bit higher. About 20% of people have OCD. Okay. And then here's what's really crazy. So it's not just these other diagnoses. There are a lot of other challenges. Like we see an increase in suicidality when you're on the spectrum. We see an increase in gender dysphoria. So this is not a diagnosis, but these are certain features, okay? So I'm going to show you all just a quick paper. Okay. Let me just show you all a couple of papers, okay? So this is what's like kind of wild. So first, suicidality in autistic youth, a systematic review and meta-analysis. So the final selection included 47 papers. Pooled suicidal ideation was 25%. Suicide attempts were 8%. This is incredibly high. Suicide deaths were 0.2%. Okay, so what this means is that, like, this is nuts, dude. 1 out of 4 people on the autism spectrum disorder is suicidal. Almost 1 out of 10 people on autism spectrum disorder try to kill themselves. Like, that's nuts. Thankfully, the number of people who are successful is quite low, right? So that's good, right? But this is super scary. It gets even worse. The combination of autism and exceptional cognitive ability is associated with suicidal ideation. So this is what's really crazy. If you're on the autism spectrum, not only is your life objectively hard, you are more likely to be suicidal. You are more likely to try to take your life. Now, here's what I see. And then the crazy thing is that, see, a lot of times we view intelligence as a protective factor. We think, oh, being like high IQ is just good, right? The higher IQ, the better it is. But if you look at, this is really interesting. If you look at income, okay, the top 10% of earners in the world have a higher IQ than the top 1%. In some ways, intelligence can actually be a disadvantage. And I see this a lot in the people that I work with. I think in my practice, I tend to see more higher functioning people on the spectrum. And basically what happens is that, you know, they have this experience of life where they recognize these difficulties. They're smart enough to understand, like, this is challenging for me and it is not challenging for other people. Then they're smart, they're very self-aware, they're like good people, and they try to fix their problems, right? They'll do things like, okay, I recognize that I have these difficulties in social emotional reciprocity, so I'm going to work on that. I'm going to go see a dating coach. I'm going to go see a therapist. I'm going to learn how to meditate. They're very, very solutions focused, and they work incredibly hard. And then what happens is they go on a date. And then, like, you know, they've put in all of this effort, and then, you know, their date orders whatever, and then they order mac and cheese with no breadcrumbs on top. Just plain mac and cheese. And then their date kind of looks at them and like, what are you, like a 4-year-old? And then they get judged. And so this is their experience. They look at their situation and they look at it and then they like calculate out. They'll make a calculation that like, okay, like I've done everything that I can do. It feels hopeless. This then gets combined with, remember, their higher level of emotional disturbance, right? So they experience some negative emotions more intensely. They experience a greater degree of stress. And then that results in suicidality. Like when I work with these people, like basically what it is a relatively accurate, in some ways, view of their life and how hopeless their life is. Because remember, the other challenge with autism spectrum disorder is that they're very concrete thinkers. So their capacity to even step outside of their mind is very difficult. So it's almost like this, like, perfect storm of, first of all, I'm smart. Second of all, I work really hard. Third of all, I have these traumatic experiences. Fourth, I make a prediction about the future that is not good. Now, in a neurotypical brain, we have things that protect us from a hopeless future. One of those things is an improved theory of mind. So when someone comes to me and says, hey, actually, your life is okay, and, I love you, and I care about you, and you'll be okay, and I had difficulty, when someone offers us this empathic support, we are able to step outside of our mind, we're able to connect with them in some way, we're able to offload our negative emotions. So we have that protective capability. Very difficult if you're on the spectrum. Second thing is the level of emotion that we feel is very, very negative. Right? So it's very intense. So whereas after a breakup, I may feel like 7.5 out of 10 hopeless, someone on this autism spectrum is statistically more likely to feel closer to an 8 or a 9 or maybe even an 11. So they experience more negative emotion, have difficulty with theory of mind, so they can't be reassured by other people on an empathic level, right? So like that empathy, what does that mean? It's not about logic, it's about feeling loved. So when someone tells me all this kind of crap, even if logically I don't believe it, I still receive their caring. Emotionally, I feel loved, I feel cared for, I feel valued. That is difficult for people on the spectrum. And then the third thing that's very difficult is concrete thinking. So once they arrive at a particular kind of conclusion, it is very hard to logically like move them away from that. Or it is very hard, oftentimes the way that we move people away from a logical conclusion is on a more abstract level of thinking. Look at the big picture. You'll get better at this over time. But then the person on the spectrum is like, what is that? Like, I don't understand. I tried to get better at it. Time number 1, time number 2, time number 3, time number 4, time number 5, time number 6. I already tried this. What do you mean it's going to get better over time? I did this. It didn't work. It's not working. There's a very, very concrete level of thinking. Very rigid level of thinking. So this is what results in suicidality. And like, this is like I hope, I mean, for me, this is what helped me understand, like, this was like a really good example of like why things are difficult. It's not just because you have the normal experience of life. It's that you have the normal experience of life with these other kinds of challenges piled on top, which makes it way harder. And so this is the other general thing. So we didn't talk about trauma, but, you know, I think like 70, 80% of people on the autism spectrum have some kind of major trauma. And it's not like that people were abusive to them or something like that necessarily. It's like there's the chances of the normal level of trauma, number one, right? So everyone has some chance of trauma. Then there is the parental frustration of having a child who is not neurotypical. Immense. It's sad, but the number of patients that I've had, when I like really like, you know, when they trust me, I'll ask them, you know, if you knew your child was going to be autistic, would you have had your child? And like, it's shocking how many of them say no. If I had known, I would have never done this. Like, it's super sad to hear, but it's so hard. It's so challenging. Oftentimes, and those are the parents that are insightful. Those are the parents that are usually the good parents. The worst case scenarios that I've seen are parents who don't even understand that their child is autistic. And they're like, I'm going to break this child so that they listen. Really nasty. You don't like crushed eggshells on your omelet? I'm going to put crushed eggshells in your Coke. I'm going to put it in your water. I'm going to put it on your rice. I'm going to sprinkle it on top of your chicken nuggets. I'm going to sprinkle it on top of your mac and cheese. We are going to fix this in you. We are not going to tolerate this kind of behavior. They don't understand that the signals that their child is receiving in their brain are very different from the signals that we receive. This combined with some of the emotional activation, they think their child is stubborn. They think their child needs to be taught a lesson. And so there's a lot of punitive impact. And the parent doesn't understand, the kid doesn't understand, the kid is fucking traumatized. So traumatized. And then what the kid does, so this is important to understand, right? So when we experience trauma, we adapt. And this is where masking comes in. So we'll talk about that in a second. Now, question becomes, okay, where does autism come from? Give me a second, chat. Okay, so let's just check in for a second. How are y'all... how are y'all doing with this? We okay? Like, what is this? Oh. Okay, this one we don't need. Give me a second. This is treatment. This one we don't want. This one we don't want. Okay, good enough. Okay, how are we doing overall, chat? Are y'all like, is this good, useful? Like, You guys want more detail, less detail, stick more with the script, stick less with the script? Y'all like the... We good? Okay. Okay. Right, so we're going to, I'm going to try to, not go too far off with examples, but also, I think it's important to illustrate to people, what the experience is actually like. So we're going to kind of stick with the script, and then I'll toss in tangents here or there, like I'm already doing, okay? All right, let's keep going. So where does autism come from? What a great question. The answer is, we don't really know, but chances are kind of everywhere. So we know that there are genetic and environmental factors to autism. This is a great paper on autism spectrum disorder. So here's we can look at risk factors. So one of the reasons that I do think that, one of the strong arguments for autism spectrum disorder being a disorder as opposed to a normal variant is if we look at something like neonatal hypoxia. So, if your brain is deprived of oxygen when you are in the womb, you have what looks like a higher than 8-fold risk, a 10-fold increased risk of autism. And when we're depriving something like that, that makes me think malfunction. Okay, there are all kinds of other things, like if you add, valproic acid during pregnancy, higher maternal age. One of the really interesting risk factors is paternal age is one of the largest risk factors for autism spectrum disorder. So folic acid intake is protective, right? So here's the strong stuff. So we know that factors during pregnancy are really important. Update on the atypicalities of the central nervous system in autism spectrum disorder. We're going to scroll down here. Right. So now we're even looking at really detailed level stuff. So if you study the brains of people who are on the autism spectrum disorder, you'll see smaller bilateral amygdalar volumes. Right. We'll see increased cerebral volume in ASD compared to developmental delay, like changes in the hippocampus, in the amygdala. These are all emotional circuits. But then there's also an element of, let me find inflammation. So there's also other kinds of things. So the gut microbiome seems to be very, very important for autism spectrum disorder. Okay. We'll talk about these in a little bit more detail. But kind of the first point to understand is that what causes autism? Well, kind of all kinds of stuff. So what do we know as the deficits? So let's start with some of the basics. So the first is gene mutations. Genetics. So as we saw earlier, this one, right? So having an older sibling with autism spectrum disorder increases the risk of autism by 16-fold, right? That's a lot. So there's absolutely a genetic component. And what we're going to do is look at these in order of what you can do about it. So there's not really much you can do about your genetics. Then we also know the intrauterine environment is very important. So we also know it's not just things like hypoxia, but we also know that some infections in pregnancy are associated with autism or increase the risk of autism, right? And I think this is all evidence that suggests that this is more of a pathology than a variant. It's probably both are true. Then we've also seen evidence of things like mitochondrial dysfunction. So what does this mean? So remember that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So if our cells have a fundamental difficulty generating energy, it's going to be kind of like this global debuff. So we've seen evidence that mitochondria can be involved in that. And then we're going to get to a couple of other things. So we're going to talk about gut-brain. So we also know that so when we're dealing with things like the brain, we know that there are things like neurotransmitters. And neurotransmitters are important, things like serotonin. 5-HT, right? That's serotonin. We have dopamine. GABA dysfunction has been implicated. So I'm gonna kind of like get technical here for a hot second, okay? Because this will become important. So let's talk about gut microbiome, neurotransmitters, and autism. So when I was in residency, there was an autism expert at this place called McLean Hospital. So McLean Hospital is one of the best psychiatric hospitals in the country, arguably the world. It's super cool because it's a freestanding psychiatric hospital. So most hospitals, they have like departments. Like there's the cardiology division, there's the orthopedics division, there's the pediatrics division, there's the psychiatry division. But McLean's one of these hospitals where all they do is psychiatry. So their divisions are like, we've got autism, we've got bipolar disorder, we've got addictions, we've got all of the subspecialties of psychiatry. And so I was talking to this person and I was like, okay, what are the treatments for autism spectrum disorder? And she was even telling me that she does a lot of like gut brain kind of stuff and a lot of like supplementation with things like iron. So even in low functioning autism spectrum disorder, things like iron supplementation, according to her, reduces things like temper tantrums. So like, how does this stuff work? Like what the hell is going on? What's up with gut microbiome, neurotransmitters, iron supplementation? So I'm going to try to just share with y'all my understanding of this, okay? Now, most of this is extrapolated from the literature, but there are tons of studies. We'll show y'all a couple that support what I'm saying, but this is kind of a clinician's take, okay? So the first thing to understand is when we have microbes in our gut, okay, we have microbes in our gut. So for every one cell in your body that is you, for every one eukaryotic cell that has your DNA, we actually have 10 prokaryotic cells or 10 bacterial cells. So your body actually houses 10 times as many bacteria as it houses your cells. Okay, this is wild. So what does a bacteria do in us? So bacteria do a couple of things. The first is that if bacteria have an unhealthy relationship with us, this results in inflammation. Anytime there is inflammation, our brain gets more messed up, our body gets more messed up. So gut microbiome in autism is very important from a very simple way. It's because of the inflammation that is triggered by the inappropriate gut bacteria. Now, why do we have inappropriate gut bacteria? Because we eat chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. Very common. So this is something to understand. Not all bacteria can digest the same things. So the gut bacteria that we will have in our body depend on what we eat. So if you eat a lot of high fiber foods, the bacteria that can break down complex fibers will grow because we're feeding them. If we eat a lot of simple carbohydrates, highly processed foods, and what do we mean by processed? This means that literally the chemical composition has been broken down ahead of time. It has been processed. So if it has been processed into simple sugars and simple carbohydrates, another kind of bacteria will grow because they don't need I don't need the enzymes to break down complex carbohydrates. I get the stuff that's already broken down. Okay. This is why when we look at things like, electrolyte replacement and IV nutrition, we break everything down. It's highly processed so that your bacteria doesn't have to do any work. Your body doesn't have to do any digestive work. So then what we have is we have a food preference that correlates with a certain kind of food. Now, here's the problem. See, the bacteria in our gut that we think are friendly are the ones that we have evolved with. We'll talk about why we've evolved with them. And so if we kind of think about it, the gut bacteria that we view as friendly are the ones that have lived there for a long time, right? We're like neighbors. We've been neighbors for millions of years. So when our immune system sees those bacteria, they're like, hey, these people have been living here for millions of years. This is not an infection. This is not a new bacteria. We know this guy. And literally what activates our immune system is proteins on the surface of the cell of bacteria. So if there are proteins that have been, where our immune system is like, oh yeah, these bacteria have been here for a long time, we recognize these proteins. No reason. This is not an enemy. This is not an outsider. This is a friendly bacteria. We're fine. Now what's happened is as our diet has changed, new bacteria have entered because we haven't had Twinkies, Dino Nuggets, or mac and cheese for most of the history of humanity. So those bacteria don't exist in our gut, the ones that eat those. As we start adding these processed foods to our diet, we get a new set of bacteria. These new set of bacteria are foreign. Our immune system is like, no, 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 this is bad. Therefore, it activates. And we know that autism spectrum is associated with neuroinflammation. Let me try to find the paper. Right, so this is a good one. I'm going to show you all this. Hold on. This one, here we go. Okay, so let's take a quick look at a few papers. First one. Maternal gut bacteria drive intestinal inflammation in offspring with neurodevelopmental disorders by altering the chromatin landscape of CD4 plus cells. I'll translate this for y'all. So here is healthy pregnancy, normal gut bacteria, pregnant, offspring, CD4 cells that are have normal behavior. Inflammation during pregnancy, gut dysbiosis. You see, these are the unfriendly bacteria over here. Activate, this looks like a kidney, IL-17, and then the offspring has behavioral abnormalities and altered CD4 plus accessibility. Okay, so there's one study. So what this basically means, CD4 plus cells have a bunch of genes. CD4 plus cells are immune cells. And when there is gut dysbiosis and inflammation during pregnancy, our immune cells get turned on in a different way, and their activity changes. And when their activity changes during development, there is inflammation, right? So it's like I'm building a house, but a hurricane goes through. So now the house that I built hasn't been stabilized yet. So the hurricane sweeps through and it messes up the way that the house is built. Then we try to patch things together. And so the foundation of the house has cracked beams on the inside. So it's not stable. So this is one of the things that has been implicated. And now we've even figured out the mechanism. The mechanism, one of the mechanisms is alteration of the activity of the genes of our immune system. Multi-level analysis of gut-brain axis shows autism spectrum disorder associated molecular and microbial profiles, right? So carbohydrate and lipid profiles predominantly encoded by microbial species in the genera Previtola, Bifidobacterium, Desulfovibrio, and Bacteroides, right? So, and correlates with brain gene expression changes, restrictive dietary patterns, and pro-inflammatory cytokine profiles. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that we figured out that these 4 bacteria are part of the culprits. Okay? And then neuroinflammation and autism spectrum disorders, exercise as a pharmacological tool. Right? And so what this means, this is saying, okay, there's neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation makes autism worse. If we reduce neuroinflammation via exercise, which reduces inflammation, this seems to help. Okay? So your mileage may vary. So we're not sure if any of this crap works. We're not sure. We're going to talk about what I think works in a second. So the key thing to understand is the gut bacteria in this inflammatory profile makes autism worse. Now let's understand how. So remember that when we're inflamed, our neurons are jittery. They're more likely to activate. And so what this means is that this stuff like this emotional dysregulation, remember the emotional dysregulation is, oh, remember this? So emotional dysregulation makes this process worse. So when we have, inflammation makes the emotional dysregulation process worse. So when we're inflamed, when our brain is inflamed, we are more likely to feel anxious. We're more likely to feel depressed. So when you get the flu, or if you get COVID, how do you feel mentally? Not good. You become more irritable. You become more depressed. It's harder to do things. Your empathy goes down, right? Your romantic, your significant other comes home and they're like, man, I had a rough day today. And you're like, I've got fucking COVID. I ain't got no time for you. And if we kind of think about it, like, let's understand this. How does that happen? It's because our brain has empathic circuits. Our neurons have a higher level of inflammation. When they have a higher level of inflammation, they become jittery. They activate very quickly. So our amygdala hyperactivates. This results in neuroinflammation. But gut bacteria also do something else. They also do neurotransmitter production. So, our serotonin precursors are developed by the gut. So that's why we're friends. Like, we have like this agreement with the gut bacteria in our body. We're like, I'm going to give you food. I'm going to give you a place to stay. In return, I need you to be a factory for my neurotransmitters. And the gut bacteria are like, got it, bruh. This is our agreement. Now, what happens when you start eating unhealthy food, highly processed food, is the gut bacteria that produce all of these things are not the ones that exist. Now you've got all these fucking bad bacteria that have moved in and they're occupying your gut, and they're lazy. They're not doing their part. So we also see in autism spectrum GABA alterations in GABA transmission, just as one example. So GABA is a neurotransmitter that, generally speaking, activates chloride channels and hyperpolarizes the membrane of neurons. Now, what the hell does that mean? This means that it calms neurons down. It makes it harder for neurons to activate. So good examples of GABAergic substances are alcohol. So alcohol kind of chills you out. Benzodiazepines kind of chill you out. They reduce anxiety. Alcohol is also an anxiolytic in some ways. So we see alterations in GABA transmission as an example. So anytime I see alterations in GABA transmission, I would expect a hyperactivity. If we're reducing the transmission, I would expect a hyperactivity in the brain, and that's what we see in autism spectrum disorder, increased emotional dysregulation. So gut bacteria become quite important because they not only increase our inflammation, they also do a lot of the work of like developing neurotransmitters. Now, there is another problem when it comes to the gut in autism. Now, this is less evidence-based. This is more clinical. So the other thing that happens is when people get started, or when people become autistic, or when they get diagnosed with autism, oftentimes we'll start them on medication. And a lot of this medication and the diet that they eat results in very small, what I believe to be nutritional deficiencies. And it's not just the diet, it's also the medication. So like when we have certain medications, remember, these are activating different channels all over our body. And one of the things, I'm thinking about this expert in autism that I worked with or who taught me things at McLean. She was sort of saying that she sees like nutritional supplementation is very, very important at helping autism because there's all these occult nutritional deficiencies which we don't detect. Now, the question becomes, how can you have a nutritional deficiency that you don't detect? And this is important to understand. So when we measure your nutrient levels, we're looking at the average population, and we say that, okay, an iron level between, like a hemoglobin between like 11 and 14, let's say, is normal. Okay, whatever. But the problem, though, is that even if you have objectively a normal level compared to the rest of the population, you don't have the same brain. So the alterations in your neuroarchitecture, the alterations in your receptor profiles, some of these genetic modifications, some of the way that your mitochondria work, mean that even though you may have a lab value that is normal, you have a functional deficiency. Because your cells maybe need a little bit more iron than average. Because we know, like, if we look at something like neonatal hypoxia, this is going to be a whole brain effect. So even there are going to be signals that measure your iron levels that in some way may be related to your brain, right? We know this because we have things like heat shock proteins and all kinds of other like measurements like hematocrit levels, and our body is sensitive to iron, ferritin levels and things like that. There's all kinds of like ways that we detect iron. Some of those mechanisms may be messed up too. We don't know. So it seems that a good diet, which is challenging because of the ARFID-like features, some of the medications probably create nutritional deficiencies or absorption problems, and then some degree of inflammation, some degree of our body needs different levels of neurotransmitters or iron or all kinds of stuff. We don't know exactly what's going on. So on a clinical perspective, fixing this stuff is very important. So in very severe cases of autism, this person was saying that she's had patients who are like, have to get hospitalized or in straitjackets and things like that, and iron supplementation seems to help them a lot. Now, practically, what does this mean for y'all? This means, first of all, don't give up hope. Second of all, get help. Third of all, if the help hasn't been helpful, don't give up help. Don't give up hope. Right? So there's so much that we're learning about autism spectrum that who knows, right? Maybe some degree of like nutrient supplementation or iron supplementation, some degree of bacterial change. This could reduce your gut inflammation, could reduce the jitteriness of your neurons, could reduce your neurotransmitter precursors, and then like you could get way better. And that's what I've seen clinically. We'll get to that later. So why do we dive into the etiology? We dive into the etiology because if we understand what's wrong, then we know how to intervene. Okay? So inflammation, gut bacteria seem to be a big part of it. Okay, so someone's saying, a ketogenic diet can greatly reduce problems related to autism. So I don't know about the veracity of that. But another, teacher of mine, a guy named Chris Palmer, he's also based at McLean. So he's a big advocate of the ketogenic diet, wrote a book about it, has been on like all these podcasts and stuff. Chris is fantastic, really good researcher, big believer in the ketogenic diet. So this is why what we're kind of saying, what I'm trying to show y'all is that like, if you're hopeless, like I understand, but there's a lot of stuff that we're still figuring out, and I'm optimistic. And I've seen good outcomes with people that I work with who are on the autism spectrum. Okay? All right. Now let's talk differences in gender in autism. And then we're going to get to masking. Okay? So, let's do this. Now, you could say, okay, Dr. K, like maybe you should have talked about this with the diagnostic features, but I don't know. I just felt like including it here. Now I'm wondering if I should have moved it up, but. So, men or boys are diagnosed let's say about 3 to 4 times as often as women or girls. Okay? We have to understand this. Diagnosis just means catching it. It doesn't mean that men or boys are 3 times as more likely to be, it doesn't mean that they have, the rates of autism are 3 to 4 times higher. It just means that we're able to catch it 3 to 4 times higher. Now, I don't know what the real number is. I suspect that it is not 1-to-1. So remember that we looked at paternal age. So I suspect that autism has something to do with the Y chromosome. That's my personal belief. So I would be very surprised if it was like actually 1-to-1. But we also know that men are more like boys, are more likely to be diagnosed because their manifestations of autism are different. They're more likely to have inattention plus hyperactivity. They're much more likely to be aggressive, have anger issues, or throw temper tantrums. And they're much more likely to be oppositionally defiant. So if we look at what's driving the diagnosis, a part of it is absolutely possible that men or boys are more likely to be autistic, but their manifestations of autism are more observable and more disruptive. So one of the challenges in mental health diagnosis is unless it's causing someone a headache, chances are we're not going to pick it up. Right? So we diagnose things the most, not when the person is suffering, but when we cause problems for people around us. When you drive while intoxicated and you get a DUI, that's what prompts addiction treatment, right? Not like half the people who are addicted to alcohol, you'll never see because they don't cause problems. They just drink at home all day. They're functional alcoholics. They hold down jobs, like whatever. It's when you cause problems for other people that we start slapping diagnoses on you. Now, girls have a different presentation of autism spectrum. So they have way more internalizing symptoms. What does this mean? They're more likely to experience depression. They're more likely to experience anxiety. They are also way better at masking. which we're going to talk about in a second. We're working our way up to masking. And they are much more likely to be vulnerable to diagnostic overshadowing. Now, what does that mean? So let's understand this for a second. So when you are on the spectrum, you can sometimes do things that cause other people problems, right? So you throw a temper tantrum. Your backpack was not packed in the way that you wanted, and suddenly you're having a meltdown and you're smashing your fists, and the parents are fed up. So they're like, you need to see a psychiatrist, right? So boy gets diagnosed with autism. Now, girls have more internalizing symptoms. So they struggle a lot more internally, right? So they have difficulties with things like eye contact and stuff like that, but they tend to shut down. They tend to involute. So when they get frustrated, they don't like externalize their frustration, their negative experience. Their internal experience gets compacted. They like pound all the negativity like inside of them. So I know that we talk about men bottling up their emotions, but I would say clinically, like with the number one winner in my book for people who are good at bottling up their emotions is autistic women. There's so much negativity and it all gets internalized. So then what happens is something called diagnostic overshadowing. So when these people present, since they don't have some of the features of autism that are visible because they mask them, girls are more likely to mask, by the way. What ends up happening is they get diagnosed with things like depression or anxiety. And we miss the autism diagnosis because they don't appear as autistic, right? So like girls are like, it's more socially acceptable. There are all kinds of things on the spectrum that are more socially acceptable, or girls learn how to like socially adapt to them. So, you know, I don't know how to say this, but like, I'm trying to figure out, like, I don't want to be offensive, but so like we have like certain like societal stereotypes. So for example, like, you know, an old lady living in the woods or like a cat lady, right? Like, so we have these stereotypes of, okay, there are people out there that are like cat ladies, and like that's like a normal variant of society. There's nothing wrong with being a cat lady. I'm just saying that this is not, we don't look at a cat lady and say like, oh, this person is mentally ill. But if like when I work with like literally my patients who are, you know, on the spectrum, who are women, many of them have difficulty in romantic relationships, right? Just like anyone else on the spectrum. But for some reason, like being a woman who's 38, being single and having 4 cats is like not a sign of a problem. This is just like, oh, there are just some women who are like that, right? They're just the cat ladies. And so these women are less disruptive. They're oftentimes incredibly accommodating, right? They're kind of like the outside friend where they like have a social circle where they get like invited to stuff. Oftentimes these girls also become gamers. They hang out with like their friends are online. So there's like these internet, you know, like the modern generation of like millennial, Gen X, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, like girl gamer who's on the spectrum. This is something we see a lot in our community. And there are studies, by the way, that show that online communication and video games are like helpful for people on the spectrum. So girls tend to mask their behaviors because if we think about it, like we socially correct girls way harsher than we socially correct boys. Now, that may trigger a bunch of dudes in the environment, but I'm not saying that we don't socially correct dudes or that your life can't be hard. What I'm saying is that, like, you know, girls are taught to be like prim and proper, right? Like you have to be proper, like you got to be accommodating, you got to be nice, like you can't be disruptive. And so like we induce much more masking for girls. This is a societal impact. Now, I haven't seen studies to this effect, but I'm sure that they're out there. So this is what tends to happen in terms of gender. Now, this doesn't mean that boys don't mask as well. Boys absolutely mask. And maybe now we'll talk a little bit about masking. Okay. But this is what we tend to see. Now, I did a video or a lecture about 2 years ago about gender identity in autism spectrum. So I'm not going to repeat everything there because we have a whole lecture on it. But we also know that the likelihood of having gender dysphoria is about 10 times the normal if you're on the spectrum. So not only is it like men and women, but there's a good chance that a large chunk of y'all are non-binary in some way. And what's going on there? So it turns out that our understanding of our gender identity has to do with, there are two major components of it. There's more than this, but these are the two major components that I think are relevant in autism spectrum. So the first is our sense of identity has in part to do with the way that other people treat us. I feel like a boy because I'm one of the boys. I feel like a girl because I'm one of the girls. The second thing is that our sense of gender identity has a lot to do with the emotional integration of our experiences. So if y'all are interested in this stuff, highly recommend y'all check out the trauma guide because we talk about this in a lot of detail there. Or if you guys want specifically the autism version, that's I should be on YouTube somewhere. But if y'all want to understand identity formation and the integration of emotional experiences into who you are, that's in the trauma guide. So what tends to happen is like there are certain things like my emotional, like what I feel makes me feel like a man, right? So like when I change a tire, when there's, you know, one day when I was 19 years old and I was on a date, we were driving down the road and we got a flat tire. And so then, you know, there's my date who's driving and then there's me and I'm like, I will change the tire. Thank God the lug nuts weren't too tight and I was able to change the tire, but I felt like a man, right? These are the experiences that make you feel like a man. So if you sort of think about it, it's not just changing the tire. It's the panic of, oh, crap, can I change this tire? Then being able to change the tire, having this girl be impressed by me changing the tire, and then it's like, now I feel like a man. Right? That's how it works. So our sense of gender identity has a lot to do with the emotional experiences that we have and the social experiences that we have, which are altered when we're talking about autism spectrum. So we see a high level of gender dysphoria, gender identity, 10x the normal population. So about 10% of people, maybe even more on the autism spectrum, have some degree of gender identity fluctuation. Okay? So those are the gender differences. Now let's talk a little bit about, I have a quote that I want to share with y'all. So now we're going to talk a little bit, before we get into treatment, we're going to talk a little bit about masking. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what it's like to be on the spectrum. I know it's like, what have we been talking about so far? I'll give you. So this is one I wish I had an attribution. So I copied and pasted a quote. This could be from a paper. I think it's maybe from a paper, maybe from the internet. Yeah, I can't find the source right now, which is a real tragedy. I'll try to find it. So I'm going to just read y'all something that I think really captures the experience of someone who's high-functioning autism, probably. My husband and I describe him as being at once the most capable and most disabled person we know. He can be the starting pitcher on his Little League team without incident, participate and perform in a school-sponsored musical, all while not actually being capable of attending school. He is currently not at school at all, and he is being referred by our local district for an out-of-placement evaluation. His dysregulation manifests in severe emotional outbursts, both verbal and physical. However, again, when regulated, he is more rational, kind, and mature than his older neurotypical brothers. Emotional dysregulation is absolutely his chief obstacle to living a life and having the chance to enjoy his many talents, and there are many. So I think that this describes well many of the challenges that my patients face, is that you are simultaneously capable and incapable, right? On a good day, you can do anything that anyone else can do and you're fine with it. It doesn't affect you at all. And at the same time, when things become disrupted, when there's that emotional dysregulation, when you're put in a particular circumstance like a party or whatever, then you can't function the way that other people do. And this is what makes it so damn difficult from a subjective experience, because you know you're capable. You know you can do it, and you can't. And then you start to hate the part of you that can't do it. And you start to wish that you could be that person who can do it all the time. There's a lot of self-hatred. There's a lot of frustration. Sometimes we see this almost this overcompensation into leaning into neurodiversity. There's almost this like rage-filled, no, I'm normal. right? But it's like, it's not driven by positivity. It's driven out of resentment. I've seen that too. And then they get mad at anyone who calls them not normal, which is like, fair enough. But also, like, where is that coming from? Is it coming from like a peace and acceptance of who you are, what your challenges are? Or is it coming out of like resentment that 50% of the time you're awesome and 50% of the time you can't live life the way that other people do, and you're so angry with yourself? And so then we get to masking. Now, there's a great questionnaire about masking that I'm going to pull up for y'all. It's called the CAT Q. So let's talk a little bit about masking, and then we'll show you all the CAT Q. So what tends to happen is if you're someone who's on the spectrum, early on, you discover something really, really important, which is that the way that you are automatically living life is not working. So like you're just living life just like any other kid. But then the world shows up and tells you that's wrong. And you're like, this is just the way that I do things. And they're like, no, do things differently. This is incorrect. So I'll give you all a really good example. This is so fucking sad, dude. Eye contact. So something about eye contact is deeply uncomfortable for some people on the spectrum. It could be eye contact. It could be that as you change your relationship, eye contact becomes more comfortable. But oftentimes, like, it's really uncomfortable for whatever reason. We don't really know why. So then what happens is, like, you know, you have parents. So you'll have like a 3-year-old kid, and the eye contact is uncomfortable for them. And remember, what we're talking about is the eye contact makes you feel like shell sprinkled on top of your omelet tastes or nails on the chalkboard. It's just when I work with my patients, they're like, it's just really uncomfortable. Like, tell me how you feel. I don't know. It just fucking sucks. I hate it. I don't know why. It activates parts of your brain that make you feel stressed out and anxious. So then what happens is you have parents who are like, look at me when I'm talking to you. And then they force eye contact. And if you guys have ever had forced eye contact, I imagine you know what it feels like. Like, forced eye contact, even for a neurotypical person, doesn't feel good. Look at me when I'm talking to you. Eye contact is one of the ways that we hide. It's one of the ways that we feel reassured. 2, when we downcast our eyes, it's a sign of shame. It's a sign of submission. There's all kinds of stuff that's rolled up into eye contact. And so a 3-year-old, 3.5-year-old child learns, hey, you need to look at me when I'm talking to you. Pay attention. Look at the teacher. So what happens is we take these kids and we force them to behave a certain way because their natural inclination is to behave this way. And then we force them to behave another way. So now if we kind of look at this, like, what does that mean? That means that the child learns early on the way that I normally am is not working. Another good example of masking is making friends. Because you're totally content playing with your trains, you know, for like 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. You don't need other humans. You're fine. But then your parents tell you, hey, like, you need to have friends. And then they force you to go on play dates. And you sort of like having friends. Like, sometimes it's fun to talk about trains. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you find someone else who also has trains. Right? But then we're kind of forced into this situation where now you have to make all these adaptations. And sometimes people on the spectrum are just as lonely as the rest of us, right? There's no, like, they're not protected. Some of them are protected against loneliness. Who knows? Some of them aren't. And so then you begin to learn that, like, life has a script. Like, all these people got this playbook of rules that you did not get. And so then what happens is you start taking your natural impulses. I like trains, but when I talk about trains for 6 hours, no one wants to be my friend. So I'm going to take a part of who I am and I'm going to shut it down. I don't like looking other people in the eyes, but people tell me that that makes me a bad friend. So I'm going to start looking people in the eyes. I feel deeply, deeply uncomfortable about the disorganization of this room. I want it this particular way, but when I do it that way, my parent with undiagnosed autism wants it a different way, and that creates conflict. Seen that too. Super sad. But boy, the therapeutic value of discovering that the reason that one of your parents treats you like shit is because they're on the spectrum too is eye-opening. Okay? So we start to mask, we start to hide ourselves. And as we start to hide ourselves, we suppress our experiences, we learn to suppress our anger, we learn to suppress our shame. But it's not just that. We also learn to suppress the positive things. I suppress my excitement. I'm so excited. Holy shit. Did you see that train? Oh my God. We learn to hide who we are when we go on dates. Why? Because the world doesn't treat us very well. We learn to hide on places like the internet, where we can find the other 1,000 people in the globe that love trains as much as we do. So we learn to hide ourselves. Now, let's take a quick look at the cat cue. Right? So when I'm interacting with someone, I deliberately copy their body language or facial expressions. So this is what they end up doing, right? So it's like, instead of just naturally, empathically mirroring someone, I have to control myself and be like, okay, this person is crying, therefore I should cry too. I monitor my body language or facial expressions. I rarely feel the need to put on an act in order to get through a social situation. See, if your neurotypical, social situations are to be enjoyed, you don't even think about them as social situations. You just call it hanging out. If you're on the spectrum, it is a social situation to get through, kind of like a surgery or an MRI. I've developed a script to follow in social situations. I will repeat phrases that I've heard others say in exactly the same way that I first heard them. I adjust my body language or facial expressions so that I appear interested by the person I'm interacting with. In social situations, I feel like I'm performing rather than being myself. In my own social interactions, I use behaviors that I've learned from watching other people interacting. So everyone does this. But if you're on the spectrum, it requires intentionality. It requires effort. I always think about the impression I make on other people. I need the support of other people in order to socialize. I practice my facial expressions and body language to make sure they look natural. I don't feel the need to make eye contact with other people if I don't want to. I have to force myself to interact with people when I am in social situations. I've tried to improve my understanding of social skills by watching other people. I monitor my body language or facial expressions so that I appear interested by the person that I am interacting with. When in social situations, I try to find ways to avoid interacting with others. That's all of us. I research the rules of social interactions to improve my own social skills. I am always aware of the impression I make on other people. I feel free to be myself when I am with other people. I learn how people use their bodies and faces to interact by watching television or films or by reading fiction. I adjust my body language or facial expressions so that I appear relaxed. When talking to other people, I feel like the conversation flows naturally. I have spent time learning social skills from television shows and films and try to use these. In social interactions, I do not pay attention to what my face or body are doing. In social situations, I feel like I am pretending to be normal. So this is the cat cue. It is I think it's a verified, it's a validated instrument for assessing masking. I think it illustrates the point, which is that what we see in masking is that social interaction is not something to be enjoyed. It is something to be studied, invested in, practiced. It is a labor. It is something to get through. And this is what masking does. Okay? Now, a lot of y'all may say, oh, but Dr. K, that sounds like me. So there's another thing that we got to talk about, which is everyone self-diagnosing themselves with the autism. And what's the deal with that? Hold on, let me find this. Okay. The reach and accuracy of information on autism on TikTok. Let's take a quick look at this paper. The informational content about autism made available on TikTok reaches a wide number of people. Most of the information provided, however, appears to be misaligned with current knowledge. It is important for healthcare providers and other professionals to be aware of the autism-related content being shared on TikTok so that they can better engage with the large community of TikTok users. So when I went through the CAT-Q, I resonated with a lot of it. So this brings us to the first thing about understanding autism. See, when we have a questionnaire and we resonate with some of it, that doesn't make us autistic. This is scored. And you have to have a score above a certain number in order to screen positive. And this is about masking, right? I don't even know if it's not like a diagnostic instrument for autism. That's the other thing to understand. So there are a couple things that are going on right now that make us all, that give us certain features of autism spectrum disorder. Now, that doesn't mean we're all autistic or we're getting more autistic. What that means is that society is changing the way that we socialize. And if we look at the way that people on the spectrum socialize, these things are starting to get blended. It doesn't mean we're all autistic. You know, I think the reasons that we're seeing a rise in the autism diagnosis are a couple-fold. The first is we're getting better at picking it up. That's number one. Number two is people are having children later. And maternal age and paternal age are associated with autism. So I think we are seeing an increase in autism spectrum disorder, not just because we're catching it, but because there are more people who are autistic now, right? So if you look like 200 years ago, like most people started having kids around the age of like 15, 16, 17. And life expectancy was like 40 years. So the idea of having a dad who's older than 50 when you're born was like, unless you're like a king or something, it doesn't happen. So just because you test positive for this stuff doesn't mean that you're autistic. There are all kinds of other factors that are going on that may lead us in this direction. Our diet on a whole, all this stuff about gut microbiome doesn't just apply to people on the spectrum. That applies to basically the society at large. We're seeing a social skills atrophy, a loss of empathic circuits, weakening of our theory of mind on society as a whole. The more time you spend in echo chambers on the internet, the weaker your theory of mind becomes. So we're seeing a lot of features that look like autism. I don't think that means that we're all becoming more autistic. Right? I think there's like, and this is what kind of frustrates me about that is like people like, oh my God, I'm so autistic. Like, no, you're not. Like, you know, cilantro or green onions on the top of your bowl of ramen doesn't taste like eggshells on the top of eggs. Like the experiences of people with autism are just incredibly difficult. Incredibly difficult. And it's not the same. So be careful about, watching something and saying, oh, does this make me autistic? I do this. That means I'm autistic. No, that's not how autism diagnosis is done. It's about, measuring a ton of things, not just like I resonate with question number 14 and I resonate with question number 18. But if you look at short form content, they can only cover one question, but that's not what makes a diagnosis. A diagnosis is like an integration of a bunch of different questions. Okay? Now, let's talk about treatment. Does that make sense? So, okay. So let's start with a couple of disclaimers. The first is I don't treat autism. I tend to treat people who sometimes are autistic. And there's a subtle difference there. I'm not an expert, so we're going to cover some evidence-based interventions, none of which I've learned formally. Okay, so let's start with treatment. So behavioral interventions. This is really common. So we have things like ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, and CBT. Okay. We also know that early intervention is good. We're going to talk about them. Don't worry, guys. Parental involvement is good. Okay. Then we have pharmacologic interventions. Then we have things like social skills training. And there's a variant called adaptive CBT. Okay. And then we also have a lot of problems because standard treatments don't work in ASD. And I'll explain what that means. Okay. So let's start here. I want to move this around. Okay, let's move it over here. All right. So let's understand treatment for autism. So we're going to do kind of like a quick review of the evidence-based approaches. Oh, whoops. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to just talk to you all about my treatment philosophy. So the first thing that we know is that the earlier you catch autism, the better off you will be. So as we are developing, as we are forming, as our circuits are forming, as we're learning how to socialize, if we intervene early, we can help people out a little bit more. So we know that early intervention and early diagnosis is very helpful. So people will go to special schools and now think about what we're doing. So we know that your brain is different, right? So if your brain is different, let's create an environment that is supportive of the brain that you have. If we think about that stress diathesis model of here is my genetics, here's my environment, it's when I combine these two things that illness arises. So if I can change my environment to be more accommodating for my genetics, then the likelihood of illness actually goes down. So parental involvement is also very important because once the parent understands what is going on with the child, their ability to parent becomes far more effective. So instead of blaming the child for, being a picky eater, like we understand that their tongue is different, their mouth is different, their brain is different, and we need to be a little bit more accommodating. So we still want them to eat healthy. And this is like the problem that parents run into. It's like, okay, well, he doesn't like anything except for mac and cheese and dino nuggets. And when I talk to parents like this, it's like, okay, well, what else have you tried? Like, let's understand what's going on. Right? So I once was working with a group of parents who were Chinese, and they would make things like mapo tofu. And if you understand what mapo tofu is, right, there's a sauce that has sometimes Sichuan peppercorns, has green onions on top, has little bits of ground pork in there, delicious dish, but it has a lot of other stuff. And if you just make it just with the tofu and the sauce and you don't add any other stuff, the kid will eat it. Doesn't like his vegetables. Well, how do you prepare your vegetables? Steamed broccoli or steamed asparagus or steamed green beans with a little bit of butter and salt, and you're fine. Use garlic powder instead of garlic, right? It's the textures that are the problem. Your child differs in the way that they need a lot of routine. They need a lot of organization. They have difficulty making eye contact. They're going to have difficulty making friends. They're not disrespecting you when they're not looking you in the eye, right? There's a lot of stuff that when parents don't understand that they're raising an autistic child, then you have two problems. You have autism, and then you have the trauma of not knowing that you have a child with autism. Incredibly frustrating for the parent, incredibly damaging for the child. So you just need to understand that your child is different. And most parents will figure out in some ways that their child is different. But there are also interventions that you can do to help them engage with society more. So early intervention and parental intervention are incredibly important. And the goal of these things, there are people who know this stuff better than I do, right? Not my area of expertise. But when we look at some of these interventions, it's to understand some of these concepts. And what I tend to find is even when I teach these concepts, parents do better, kids do better. So let's problem solve around how to have you eat things. Over the course of 7 days, I'm going to make you mac and cheese and dino nuggets, altering each day of the week. And we're going to try in a very intentional way. We're going to try sweet potato. We're going to try regular potato. We're going to try green beans. We're going to try asparagus. We're going to try broccoli. We're going to try smoothies. Right? We're going to try a lot of stuff and see what works for you. That's the emphasis of the treatment, at least when I treat it. Now let's talk about things like behavioral interventions like ABA and CBT. So applied behavioral analysis is about getting kids who are on the spectrum to fit into society, right? We're going to change their behavior. Now, ABA, I have mixed feelings about. So on the one hand, ABA is I believe, well-tested, well-understood intervention that is effective at treating the symptoms of autism. We're going to shape someone's behavior. In many cases, the experience of people on the spectrum who go through ABA is traumatic, results in masking. Some people have argued that ABA is essentially a course in masking. Okay? Now, I've had patients who appreciate ABA, and I've had patients who hate ABA. I also think that one of the things that we don't really consider with ABA is that I've seen a variety of professionals in terms of their competency with ABA. So this is what a lot of people don't realize. ABA is its own separate path of training in some places. So you don't have to become a therapist to be an ABA person. You can just study ABA directly. Now that's has pluses and minuses. On the one hand, it's good because we can train people directly. We can train people in a very specialized way. On the downside, in a lot of the ABA people that I've worked with, some of them don't have some of the basics of what a therapist has. Right? So they're trained in a particular kind of protocol. And we see this a lot in mental health and even physical health, right? We're seeing a lot of physician assistants, nurse practitioners, and medical doctors, and they have different levels of training. On some level, they can all do the same thing. And on some, but are they really all the same at the end of the day? I don't believe so. And it's not about superiority or inferiority. I don't think it's about ego. It's just, if you spend 8 years in school versus 2 years in school, if you see 10,000 patients versus 1,000 patients, I think that there's going to be a difference. That's all. So ABA is an evidence-based approach that can work. And some people have very negative experiences of it. Now, then the confusing thing, like I said, is some of it is what is that? What part of that is the intervention, and what part of that has to do with the person who's doing ABA to you? Okay. Let me just show you all a paper real quick. Ugh. Hold on. Oh yeah, okay. Here it is. So let's just take a quick look at a paper, okay? Intensive intervention for adolescents with autism spectrum disorder, comparison of 3 rehabilitation treatments. So in our study, we evaluated the effect of 3 different high-intensity interventions, namely applied behavioral analysis, treatment and education of autistic and communication handicapped children, TEACH, and behavioral education intervention, BEI. In 93 ASD adolescents ranging from 12 to 8 years, our results showed that all adolescents with ASD reported an improvement of core symptoms regardless of treatment type. Okay? So what this kind of means, here's how I take this away. And it's been a long time since I looked at this paper, so I don't remember the details of it because I read this a month ago. So we know that there's a lot of behavioral interventions. It doesn't seem that one is superior to another. So practically, when I'm working with patients who are anti-ABA, I say, fuck it. Don't do ABA. You don't need to do ABA. If you don't like it, if you feel like it's masking, if you feel like it's traumatizing, if you feel like it's disconnecting from who you are, don't do it. It's not like there aren't others. And this is a really common experience in psychiatry and psychotherapy and medicine in general. Generally speaking, the intensity of what you do is very important, as opposed to the kind of thing that you do. So in psychotherapy, I do think the kind of psychotherapy you do is very important, but it's not that one is objectively better than the other. It's that you have to find something that fits well with you and you have to do it seriously. So whether you want to do Jungian dream analysis, or you want to do cognitive behavioral therapy, or you want to do dialectical behavioral therapy with a heavy dose of mindfulness, it's all going to work relatively well. If you take it seriously, it'll all work. It's about finding the thing that fits for you. So a lot of people will argue about ABA. I think it's fair enough. Like, it's not my place to say that everyone should do ABA. I'm not an expert in ABA. Some people will say, hey, ABA is the thing. Helps some people, doesn't help other people. Fair enough. Okay? So behavioral interventions work. So now we get to a couple of other things. So let's talk about pharmacology. So generally speaking, we do not have medications that treat autism. So as I've shown y'all, hopefully, autism comes from all kinds of places. It comes from your intrauterine environment. It comes from your genes. It comes from your upbringing. It comes from the age of the Y chromosome in the sperm. It also comes from the level of inflammation. It also comes from GABA transmission. It also comes from all kinds of stuff. So there is not a treatment for autism. And I think this is what sort of helps us, argue that it's not a discrete pathology as well. So on the one hand, we know that neonatal hypoxia leads to the risk of it, which makes me think that it is a pathology, but it's not like there's one piece that's broken. We also know, based on some of these stories like The Big Short, that there are some people on the spectrum that are capable of doing things that people who are not on the spectrum may not be capable of. So there could be an argument for some kind of adaptive or evolutionary advantage of some of these features of autism. There's also some kind of anthropological, I even hesitate to call it evidence, but there's some anthropological evidence or opinions that if we look at some of these things like the Oracle at Delphi and like some of these other like weird Greek mythology, that some of these like religious or spiritual figures may have had some kind of autism. So I've seen like some papers about that. I don't know if that really qualifies as like hard scientific evidence. It's just evidence from a soft science standpoint. So pharmacology can be useful. So there isn't a pharmacology that like works, but we have all kinds of things. So we'll use things like, alpha agonists. We'll use blood pressure medications. We'll use antipsychotics. We'll sometimes use things like sertraline or like serotonergic medications. Those don't really work that great. And usually what we're targeting is like symptomatic treatment of things. Why do we give kids on the spectrum antipsychotics? Because we want to prevent outbursts. Because we want to like slow down that, like we'll give people sometimes like mood stabilizing medication so that the jitteriness of their neurons kind of calms down. So I think that like there's all kinds of pharmacologic agents out there, let me try to find, right? So like, let's just take a quick look at a paper. So this is from Neurotherapeutics in 2022, an update on psychopharmacological treatment of autism spectrum disorder. So commonly used medications to address comorbidities. Let's see. Okay. So medications including metformin, arbaclofen, cannabidiol, oxytocin, these are potential treatments. These are new things, chat. This is not what works. This is what people think may work. I'm just looking at this because this is not the list. This is like new potential treatments, right? So the point here is that there's all kinds of stuff that like could be useful. So this is like a statin medication. Metformin is something that we give to people with diabetes. There's all kinds of stuff. Commonly used medications to address comorbidities with ASD include atypical antipsychotics, serotonergic agents, alpha-2 agonists. This is a medication like clonidine, stimulant medications, etc. So there's a lot of stuff out there that can help, and I would say nothing is going to cure you of anything. So it is a tool. Pharmacology is a tool in our tool belt. And I would even say that autism spectrum disorder is one of the diagnoses where our medications are not great. Okay. And then the last thing is that people are developing, novel treatments in the realm of things like social skills training. So these are like formal educational classes. ABA draws on some of this stuff, but I think social skills training is a little bit more patient-centered as opposed to like confirmation-centered. where we're going to teach you how to socialize. It's not about inducing a behavior. It is like we're going to equip you with information and try to balance this out a little bit. So once again, I'm not an expert in autism treatment by any means, and I'm sure that there are going to be people who are watching this who know more about autism treatment than I am, and by all means, comment, tell me share your wisdom with the rest of us. Now, when I'm working with someone with autism, this is the last thing that we'll talk about. How do I approach working with them? So there's all this stuff. How do I know what to do? So here's how I understand it. The first thing is to resolve the discrepancy between internal and external. Now, what the hell does that mean? So the world is a particular way, and you are a particular way. The first thing that I do with my patients is figuring out, what of this do you want to change? So this will be like really simple stuff. Like, are you tired of masking? By the way, masking correlates with worsening mental illness. So we know that it's damaging in some ways. So the first thing is, what do you want to change? Do you want to be different on the inside? Do you want to change the person that you are? Are you interested in fitting with the rest of the world? Right? This is the first thing that we have to figure out. Do you want to adapt yourself to the external world, or do you not want to do that? And everyone's on a spectrum. Like, some people will come to me and say, you know, what I want more than anything else, the majority of patients I've worked with are men. So what they'll come in is they'll say, like, okay, by majority, I mean maybe like 60 to 70%. They'll say, like, I want a girlfriend and I feel incredibly alone. I'm suicidal. If I just had a relationship, that's the one thing that's missing in my life. This is what I want. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get there. Okay, fair enough. So then we'll start changing the person that you are to, not the person that you are. We'll work on your internal environment with the goal of adaptation. We're going to work on social skills. We're going to work on temper tantrums. We're going to work on eye contact, socialization. We're going to figure out some way that you can get to your goal. If that's social scripting, if that's eye contact, if it's hugging, if it's learning how to eat different food, like whatever. So then, like, the question becomes, okay, what gets in the way of you having a girlfriend? Well, when I go to dinner, my dates are always like, make fun of me, and I feel ashamed because I order mac and cheese wherever I go. Okay, fair enough. So now we've got two options. Do you want to learn how to eat things besides mac and cheese, or do you want to learn how to deal with the shame of eating mac and cheese and work on other ways that people can accept you? Does that make sense? There's not like a right answer or wrong answer. So the foundation of when I work with someone with autism is like, let's figure out this internal versus external. What do you want to focus on? Do you want other people to accept you? Is that what you want to shoot for? Or do you want to focus on like being yourself more? Second thing that we work on is this issue of masking. So the way that we work on this is that oftentimes people who are on the spectrum, I do this with all my patients, but it's manifests slightly differently, is that we have certain internal drivers and external reactions, or even internal reactions. And there's a method of masking, by the way, that has nothing to do with behavior. There's something called compensation, which is something that we do cognitively to ourselves to fit with everything else. It's not even a behavior. It's a mental response. So then we start to dig into, okay, what are all the internal things that you experience? I feel anger. I feel frustration. I feel shame. I only want to eat this food. And then how do you respond to those things? I mask it. I lie about it. I try to force myself to do it anyway. So we start to gain insight into the autopilot nature of autism. And that's really important, because the main thing that it's not about doing something right or wrong. It's about, let's stop behaving automatically. Let's think through what our inputs are, how we deal with those inputs, and what our outputs are. So when your friends, when you guys are queuing up for a game and then like one of them picks the character that you want to play, I always play DPS. And in my D&D group, I'm the rogue in the party. And someone else showed up and now they're playing a rogue. They're cramping on my style. I'm really angry about that. So let's understand, okay, how does it feel? Well, this is the script that I know, right? Like when I was learning to play D&D, like I learned how to play rogue. And I understand what a rogue is supposed to do. I'm supposed to abandon the party and go steal things while the rest of them get bored because I'm sneaking around. I'm supposed to make the DM's life harder. That's my job as a rogue. I'm going to play a single-player game while pretending to play a co-op multiplayer game. I know this. So whatever it is. And if I have one thing that gives me some degree of competency in working with autism, I've played D&D. Okay. So we just have to understand, okay, what's going on within you? What are your internal experiences? How do you react to those? How do you interact with the world? And the more that you open up this process, the better people get. They learn to deal with their shame a little bit. They learn to deal with their reactions. They learn not to react, right? They think through things and then they address things in the right way. And over time, they level up. Oftentimes, these are social interactions. Okay? So that's dimension number one, is figure out what you want. How much of this is internal work? How much of this is external work? Dimension number two is let's stop operating on autopilot. Let's understand what your triggers are, what you feel, and how you respond, and which of those we want to change. Then there are a couple of other dimensions. There's a pharmacologic dimension. So if medications are appropriate, we'll do that. I have very little experience with the psychopharmacology of autism spectrum disorder. Thankfully, most of my patients who have autism have other providers who will handle their medications for them. Just not something I'm very experienced in. Right? I understand some of the basics. Okay, we got some temper tantrums, maybe take a little bit of clonidine. If it's very severe, maybe we'll use an antipsychotic. Right? I'm not going to try an SSRI because chances are it won't help much. Another thing that I found is quite helpful, could be placebo, we don't really know, is doing all this diet, exercise, gut microbiome, inflammation, meditation kind of stuff. Doing the wellness. That's what I tend to do pretty well. So let's understand. Okay, what's going on here? Let's get your levels checked. Let's try this iron supplementation. Let's understand what your symptoms are. If you have, for some reason, this one person told me that iron supplementation helps with temper tantrums, let's give it a shot. Right? We're going to monitor your iron levels, make sure you don't have iron toxicity. You're going to get constipated. So we got to give you something for that. Fair enough. So we can do some amount of nutritional supplementation. I work a lot on diet and inflammation reduction. Seems to help. And then the last dimension that we tend to work on quite robustly is emotional regulation. So I find that emotional regulation is the primary obstacle. It's the thing that will sandbag you when you're doing everything else right. So once you learn how to script social interactions, once you learn how to flirt, once you learn how to order mac and cheese with a side of broccoli, once you do everything right, it is the temper tantrums and the emotional dysregulation that will damage your relationships. So that has to be addressed. So that can be everything from the inflammation management, exercise management, to things like meditation, to things like decompressing your samskaras, all of that kind of stuff. Right? And over time, I think the other value of something like a therapeutic interaction is we try to accept this person. Right? So we try to form a foundation of a relationship where they feel more emotionally comfortable, hopefully, where they can try out a little bit of eye contact, whatever. And so it seems to help. So that's kind of how I approach things. So I would say first of all, and then there's also a gender dysphoria component, which also has to do with emotional regulation and getting in touch with your feelings and not masking yourself and understanding the way that you feel and all that good stuff. That's a part of it too. So, I think that autism spectrum disorder can be a very, very crippling diagnosis. And for some people, it doesn't feel crippling at all. I think key things to understand, take away, number one is it's variable. It's a spectrum. And it doesn't matter what is right or wrong. The most important thing is what your experience of the disorder is. Right? So people are like, ABA works, ABA sucks, whatever. It can work. It can suck. So remember that if you've got autism, it's not about treating autism. It's about treating a person, a human, who happens to have autism spectrum disorder. You are not an autist. You are a person with autism. It does not define you unless you want it to. If you want it to, then go for it. Gamer. I'm a person who plays video games, not a gamer. Right? I'm an alcoholic. I'm a diabetic. That's up to you. So if you're struggling with this stuff, acknowledge a couple of things. Well, first of all, it's different. Secondly, recognize that your brain is different from neurotypical people's brains. That is almost certainly going to make your life harder. I cannot think of a single person I've ever worked with whose diagnosis of autism has made their life easier. I'm not saying better or worse. This is important to understand. Literally, every person I've worked with, and there could be a selection bias, right? There could be people out there who have autism spectrum disorder whose lives have been easier as a result of it, but they're not the ones that wind up in a psychiatrist's office. But my overwhelming experience is that these people are playing like some new game plus. Even the basic things are really hard, right? That's like, new game plus is like even your first boss, it has more HP than the last boss of your first run. So many of the basics are very difficult. Now, the good news is that if you have autism spectrum disorder, there are some things that could be advantageous about it. Really depends on your particular patchwork of symptoms and whatnot. And the more important good news is whether it's an advantage or disadvantage or whatever, everyone gets caught up in that. I think the main thing is like, it's about the way that you want to live. And what I have seen very consistently is that it does not have to prevent you from living a fulfilling life. And if I had to say, like, my crux of treatment for autism spectrum disorder is let's help you live a fulfilling life. Whatever that entails. If medication is a part of that, great. If forcing yourself through ABA is a part of that, great. If meditation is a part of that, great. If changing your diet is a part of that, great. But the whole point, this is kind of a weird advantage, is that we have so many different interventions. It's not like there's a silver bullet, which also means that there's a lot of variety. So you don't have to do this one thing that everyone says is great. There's lots of different options out there. And we do see that things work. Right? People get better. People engage in relationships. People get married. People have kids. People find jobs. It's doable. It's just hard. And I don't know. I don't like, it's one of those things where like, I don't know that it evens out in the end in some way. Like, I just don't. I don't know, like from a medical standpoint, spiritual standpoint, karmic standpoint, whatever. From a medical standpoint, like, you know, if you get diagnosed with a glioblastoma multiforme at the age of 26, which is a rapidly progressing and basically fatal brain tumor, happens between the ages of 25 and 40, like, I don't think that evens out somewhere. I just don't, not in this lifetime. Sometimes people just have it worse than other people. Like, I wish I could say that it wasn't like that, but like, that's my experience as a psychiatrist. Like, some people just have worse lives. And so like our job is not, I mean, it's really easy to get bent out of shape over that. I empathize, but like our job is, you know, I don't know how useful that is. Our job is to help you get to wherever you want to go. I don't care where you start. I don't care how hard your life is. What's my job? My job is to help you to get you where you want to go. The only difference is the amount of work that we have to put in. And I'm sorry that if your chances are you're on the autism spectrum, you're probably gonna have to work way harder than neurotypical people. I think that's a pretty safe, evidence-based kind of scientific statement. But don't give up hope just because it's hard. It's easy to give up hope, especially if you're smart, because you can project out into the future, but recognize some of these problems like the concrete thinking and the hyper-emotionality, that this is going to change the way that you see things. We know scientifically that you're more likely to be suicidal. Don't give up hope. It's okay to have hopelessness, but try to get some help. Last... since I'm painting such a delightful picture. Last thing to consider about autism spectrum treatment is that we're getting better at it. So the one reason that I have hope is, you know, the last time I had a full-time practice, which had a fair number of people that had autism spectrum disorder in it, we did not know, this was like maybe 6 years ago, something like that. I don't even know. But we've learned so much in the last few years. We're getting better at it. The other kind of weird silver lining is that everyone is having more features of autism. So it's becoming a more common, like society is taking it more seriously as a whole. Okay? So that concludes our deep dive into autism spectrum disorder. There is so much more we could talk about. I have a list of like 20 or 30 questions and posts that really capture some of these things that we could address individually. We haven't gotten to dating with autism, having a career with autism, being an entrepreneur with autism, meditation with autism spectrum disorder. All of these things deserve their own time and energy, right? But this is what we kind of start with. I hope it's been helpful to y'all. And like, this is the beginning, right? This is not the end. This is just this is like a preview. And if y'all are struggling with autism, you have my condolences, you have my sympathies. I wish I could say you have my empathy, but one of the things I learned a while ago, I have some degree of probably, empathy for some neurodiversity on the ADHD spectrum, and there's some overlap there and things like that. But I mean, I really don't, and this is one of the things that I learned as a clinician is, I really don't know what it's like. And the closest then after working with people for years, the best I have is it's sprinkled eggshells on top of your omelet, right? And when you just think about it, like how hard life is when fucking everything that you do is that. Now I have to go to a job interview and I have to have eye contact. Now I'm going on a date and I have to figure out what's the right level of humor. Now I have to figure out when to grab their ass so that we can advance the sexual relationship. But if I do it too early, I'm going to get accused of sexual assault. Like, it's so hard. Everything becomes difficult. And I just don't know what that life is like. And I don't think many people do. And I think like us neurotypical people need to stop pretending that we know what it's like to be on the spectrum. We really don't know. It's crazy, man. Some of the stuff like RFID and like socialization, we take so much, we have no idea. And so the primary responsibility for us people who are neurotypical is to try to have some compassion. Let's cut them a little bit of slack. Cut them a little bit more slack. Let's try a little bit harder to incorporate them, to help them feel welcome, to recognize that just because I feel uncomfortable with a lack of eye contact does not mean that I should force this other person to do something that makes me feel comfortable. That's the most damaging thing. Parents do it, boyfriends do it, girlfriends do it, friends do it. I don't like the way that your behaviors make me feel. I want you to change so I feel better. How selfish. Does that make sense? Okay. So, people are saying, please post this ASAP. I think this is live streamed to both Twitch and YouTube. There's a VOD that's available that anybody can watch, and it'll probably live on in some way on the YouTube channel as well. So thank you all very much for coming today. I guess we're going to do questions for like 5 minutes, but we're already 40 minutes over. Let me just double check my schedule. Good. If Bruce feels heard, we are happy. Let's do a couple of questions. What a bruiser. Oh my God, I love this community. Does experiencing ego death help coping with autism? Okay, what a awesome question. I think so. I would think so, but honestly, I've never thought about it. Let's see. Hold on a second, chat. I'm so curious. Spectrum disorder psychedelics. Let's see if there's a paper. Interesting. Okay, so we're gonna have to look at this. Holy based, dude. Holy based. Okay. Evaluating the potential use of serotonergic psychedelics in autism spectrum disorder. Okay, this is McGill. Let's see. Whoa. So there are studies from the 60s and 70s. We highlight the positive behavioral, including enhanced mood and social behavior, as well as the adverse effects of these trials, including increases in aggressive and dissociative and psychotic states. Okay. No cookies. Okay. Let's see. Glutaminergic system, which would play the systematic review comprehensively discussed the prevalence trends of autism and youth suicide globally and in Taiwan, and discussed an association between autism and suicidality. That we know. Furthermore, this review proposed a neurobiological connection between autism, suicide, and psychedelics. Okay. Okay. Oh, so there's one other thing I didn't talk about in treatment. So standard treatments don't work great. So what does that mean? So there's one, this is important. One thing to remember about autism spectrum disorder is if you have a comorbid diagnosis, remember that the use of serotonergic agents in the treatment of something like a mood disorder, like major depressive disorder, something like, let's say, sertraline, okay, or fluoxetine, SSRIs. All of these studies are done in neurotypical individuals. If you're on the spectrum, that's an exclusion criteria from being included in the study. So one of the most frustrating things about psychiatric treatment, if you're on the spectrum, is it's not clear. So all of the studies are done in people that are not on the spectrum, or not all. The original FDA approval studies, and like when the drug company is like marketing the drug and developing the drug, they don't include autism. So there's a lot of like, your mileage may vary. Now, does experiencing ego death help with coping with autism? Short answer is I don't know, but I would guess probably. Why did I look at studies on psychedelics? Because we also know that the ego death experience correlates. So when you have a psychedelic experience, if you just like hallucinate and stuff, that doesn't necessarily lead to any mental health benefits. It appears that an ego death experience is what correlates with mental health benefits. And there is a huge caveat that, I don't know if y'all know this, but MDMA recently got rejected by the United States Food and Drug Administration as a treatment. So there was an application to make MDMA a treatment for like PTSD or whatever, and that was rejected. Now, the reason it was rejected, now a lot of people will say like, oh, this is because of like big pharma, and I don't know. I mean, that stuff could be true. I don't know. But I think like a much simpler reason is that the evidence is just not quite as compelling as people think, right? So we have these small studies. Some people show a big benefit, but a lot of people don't get like cured by MDMA. And so we're not quite sure, and the data is just not there yet, which I think is a good take on psychedelics as a whole. So can trauma such as complex PTSD cause neurodivergence? No. I'm going to say no. So could be wrong. But what we know is that neurodivergence, like we said, has a lot of data that shows that it has a very genetic and physiological root. Neonatal hypoxia. Genetics are very important. Neuroinflammation. The process of PTSD is different. Now, one thing that can absolutely happen is you can have autism spectrum disorder and have PTSD, in which case the two really blend together in a mush of awfulness. We also know that some of the manifestations of things like PTSD can be very similar to the manifestations of things like autism spectrum. So, for example, both disorders have emotional dysregulation, temper tantrums, executive dysfunction, difficulties with attention, sometimes difficulties with socialization, a lot of difficulties forming relationships, difficulties in empathy. All of these can come from trauma. So if y'all want details on that, definitely check out the trauma guide. It is one of the things that I personally am the most proud of. Like, I think I did a good job with that. But there's a lot of similarities. But I think it's very important. This is why we talk about etiology, because just because all the symptoms look the same does not mean that they're the same on the back end. Right? So I have difficulty. My car doesn't leave the driveway. Now, there could be a problem in the engine, or there could be a problem in the tire. There could be a problem in the gear shaft. There could be lots of problems that keep my car still. Just because the car isn't moving does not mean that one causes the other. We don't say that a flat tire causes a problem in your engine. That's not how it works. The etiologies are different. Great question. Let's see. What is the Ayurvedic take on autism? Great question. So Ayurveda classifies autism, I think, as something called an unmada. So there's some like developmental delay kind of things, and it classifies that way. I don't know exactly what the doshic balance is, and I don't know what the treatments are or how effective they are. But it's like one of these things that's like sort of like an incurable disease, if that kind of makes sense. How do I know if I'm subclinical or highly masked ASD, or if I'm modeling my parents' ASD symptoms? Do you have any other suggestions for being a child of someone with autism? What about being in a relationship with someone with autism? So if you're concerned at all, like you're like trying to figure out, am I autistic or not? My recommendation is to spend less time on short form content like TikTok and spend more time speaking to a clinical professional. So remember that, like, I know there's a lot of people who are into testing, but the majority of psychiatric diagnoses are still accomplished through clinical means. You don't have to get tested for ADHD. You don't need to get tested at all. A clinician can make a diagnosis of ADHD. A clinician can make a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Now, tests are useful tools, right? So, like, it's just like with a heart attack. I don't need an EKG to diagnose a heart attack. What you need is, like, history. Right? You can ask people questions and figure out if they had a heart attack or not. Now, EKG is just one of the tools. But it's like, you know, I mean, if y'all have practiced clinical medicine, you understand this. Like if someone has a heart attack and their EKG is normal, you scratch your head and you get another EKG, or you check their troponin or something like that. Right? And like some of the biggest mistakes in medicine is when we use tests as substitutes for clinical assessments. Because someone has some kind of bundle branch block or something like that. And since they have some abnormality, some congenital abnormality of the heart or something else, it masks the EKG detecting a myocardial infarction. And then the AI-based read on the EKG, it says normal rhythm. But hold on a second. Two wrongs can sometimes look right. Same is true for something like autism spectrum disorder. So I wish that, I know that all y'all are like, oh, like, how do I figure this out without seeing a professional? See a professional. That's what they're there for. Right? And it's a great question. It's like, how do I know the difference between whether I have autism or whether this is like learned behaviors from my artistic parents? That's a perfect question for a professional. Okay. Dr. K, my autism syndrome had a side effect of giving me genius level intellect. Do you have any specific advice for genius autists or savants? Yes. Absolutely, man. But that's a whole topic for a whole nother day. So I've worked with a ton of people who are neurodiverse and have high IQ. That's part of the reason I included that bit about suicide. A lot of them are very highly suicidal. So I think if you guys want, we can do, like, maybe we should do a stream about, you know, how to live life if you're a genius. Because I think it's a different set of rules. And IQ correlates with suicidality, not just in autism. I think, you know, the basics is something that I would already share when I was talking about the suicidality. So the basics are that if you're a genius who is on the spectrum, your genius is going to be handicapped by some of the features of autism spectrum disorder. And the real solution to let your genius flow is to address those things. So focus on concrete thinking, focus on emotional dysregulation. Like, those are two of the biggest things. Because that's really going to, like, it keeps these people from flying. And when we can focus, when we can reduce the concrete thinking, when we can improve theory of mind, and we improved emotional dysregulation, it's kind of like these are like sandbags that are weighing us down. And when we get rid of these three things, then the genius will fly. But as long as you're having temper tantrums and you're a genius, your genius will have a lot of difficulty manifesting. As long as you cannot see the shortcomings in your logical thought process, it creates a lot of problems. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but see, if you're feeling emotionally hopeless, your intellect will run in that direction and will develop a very, very strong argument why you should give up. Because the robustness of the argument depends on your analytical capability. And so then these people have this profound hopelessness because it's logically backed. Right? 150 IQ developed argument for why my life is not worth living. Very hard argument to argue against because it's so much better. So oftentimes what gets in the way is that we don't realize we're not in control of our intellect. Our shame factors in, our trauma factors in, our hopelessness factors in. This is why depression is worse. There's a whole lecture we did on why higher IQ people are more likely to be depressed and suicidal. It's simply because in depression, the mind gets turned against us. And the more powerful the mind, the more damaging it can be. Right? So if I'm playing like a video game and I cast mind control and I get to control one of my enemies, if I mind control a level 1 fighter versus a level 20 fighter, which one is going to be more damaging? So that's what happens in depression, is our IQ gets turned against us. So a big part of when I work with people who are twice exceptional, which is like people who are high IQ and have some kind of neurodiversity, is it's about really focusing on the things outside of intellect. And the problem with people, if you're super smart and on the spectrum, or even if you're super smart, is that oftentimes when you're very intelligent, you are emotionally stunted. Why? It's because when you're growing up, your brain learns to use IQ as a substitute for all kinds of other mental faculties. So I don't need to be empathic because my cognitive ability to understand a social situation, I can break things down into a protocol or an analysis. I don't need to feel because I can calculate. So then what happens is, I see this a lot, and this is why like high IQ kids are so far behind in life. Because they focus on the IQ so much that they don't develop the other parts of themselves. I never learned how to study because I didn't need to. I figured everything out until I hit pre-calculus. And I couldn't figure out pre-calculus. Then you hit a wall. So oftentimes the focus should not be the IQ, the focus should be everything else. Get in touch with your emotions. Right? So why is it that kids who are super smart struggle with motivation? It's because motivation doesn't come from the part of our brain that does analysis. Motivation comes from our emotional circuits of the brain and our reward circuits of the brain. See, once the motivation is there, then the analysis comes in. The analysis is not what drives you. It's the how you get there once you've decided to move. So if you're someone who's on the spectrum, this is going to be doubly difficult because you may have not invested a lot in empathy and it may be a little bit more difficult for you to begin with. And I think that there's like a lot of good work that can be done. There's also a lot of work around shame that has to happen if you're twice exceptional. A lot of trauma work too. All right. Okay, y'all. That's our time for today. Thank you all so much for coming. I know we ran about an hour long. I knew it was going to be about an hour long, but there's a lot to cover. There's a lot more to cover. So, by all means, some people were like, is this going to be posted? I want to share it with my friends. By all means, share it with your friends. And then also let us know, right? So when this goes up on YouTube or whatever, like, let us know if y'all have questions and stuff. If you want to share your experiences, like leave comments and stuff, we read that stuff. So I'm working on a lecture about, so we did we did this YouTube upload about how to ask for help if you're a dude. And the top comment on that video was, I tried to ask for help for a dude and boy, was I punished for it. This is my experience. So now we're doing a follow-up video on why you shouldn't ask for help. What are the experiences of people who ask for help, right? Why is it a bad idea to ask for help? And we wouldn't have that perspective unless y'all communicate with us. So when we say, hey, we're here because of you, it's not just for you, it's that this is interactive. So we decide what to talk about based on what y'all ask for, right? So thank y'all very much for coming today. If y'all have been interested in coaching, just a quick reminder that we finally have spots open on the personal, the group, and the career side. So we do things like deep dives where we introduce y'all to these topics. But if y'all are interested in really focusing on making a change and investing in that, then I'd highly recommend coaching. If you're struggling with things specifically related to autism, I would say start with a therapist. But if y'all are interested in career goals and stuff like that, there's a lot of things that we don't get trained in as therapists. So we don't get trained in helping someone find a job. So from a career coaching standpoint, coaching is a discipline that's really about goal achievement, and that's what it really focuses on. So if y'all are interested in getting outcomes in a fixed amount of time, then I'd strongly recommend y'all check out coaching. Thank y'all very much for coming today. And next week, we're going to be talking with Ali Matu about social anxiety. Brilliant clinician, awesome content creator in his own right. He's going to be sharing us. He's a specialist in anxiety, so we're going to be getting some of his expertise. So y'all take care. If you'll say more stuff on autism, what? What is the more stuff? Give me a direction. Okay? So thank y'all very much. We'll see y'all. We have 2 memberships lectures on Wednesday and Friday on Deep Dive into Emotions and Deep Dive into Intuition. Otherwise, we'll see y'all next week. Okay? Take care, everybody.